Chapter 8. Making a Mess of Marriage, Mating, and Monogamy.
Marriage is the most natural state of man, and therefore the state in which you are most likely to find solid happiness. Benjamin Franklin. Love is an ideal thing. Marriage a real thing. A confusion of the real with the ideal never goes unpunished. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe.
When Albert Einstein proclaimed that E equals mc squared, no physicists asked each other, "What's he mean by E?" In the hard sciences, the important stuff comes packaged in numbers and predefined symbols. Imprecise wording rarely causes confusion. But in more interpretive sciences, such as anthropology, psychology, and evolutionary theory, misinterpretation and misunderstanding are common. Take the words love and lust, for example. Love and lust are as different from each other as red wine and blue cheese, but because they can also complement one another splendidly, they get conflated with amazing, dumbfounding regularity. In the literature of evolutionary psychology, in popular culture, in the tastefully appointed offices of marriage counselors, in religious teachings, in political discourse, and in our own mixed-up lives, lust is often mistaken for love. Perhaps even more insidious and damaging in societies insistent on long-term sexually exclusive monogamy, the negative form of that statement is also true. The absence of lust is misread as indicating an absence of love. We'll explore this in Part 5. Experts inadvertently encourage us to confuse the two. Helen Fisher's Anatomy of Love, a book referenced earlier, is far more concerned with shared parental responsibility for a child's first few years than with the love joining the parents to one another. But we can't blame Fisher, as the language itself works against clarity. We can sleep with someone without ever closing our eyes. When we read that the politician made love with the prostitute, we know that love had little to do with it. When we report how many lovers we've had, are we claiming to have been in love with all of them? Similarly, if we mate with someone, does that make us mates? Show a guy a photo of a hot-looking woman and ask him if he'd like to mate with her. Chances are good he'll say, or think, sure. But chances are also high that marriage, children, and the prospect of a long future together never entered into his decision-making process. Everyone knows these are arbitrary expressions for an almost infinite range of situations and relationships. Everyone, it appears, but the experts. Many evolutionary psychologists and other researchers seem to think that love and sex are interchangeable terms, and they throw together copulating and mating as well. This failure to define terminology often leads to confusion and allows cultural bias to contaminate our thinking about human sexual nature. Let's try to hack a path through this tangled verbal undergrowth.
Marriage. The fundamental condition of the human species. The intimate male-female relationship, which zoologists have dubbed a pair bond, is bred into our bones. I believe this is what sets us apart from the apes more than anything else. Franz de Waal. The majority of husbands remind me of an orangutan trying to play the violin. Honoré de Balzac.
The holy grail of evolutionary psychology is the human universal. The whole point of the discipline is to tease out intrinsically human patterns of perception, cognition, and behavior from those determined on a cultural or personal level. Do you like baseball because you grew up watching games with Dad, or because the sight of small groups of men strategizing and working together on a field connects to a primordial module in your brain? That's the sort of question evolutionary psychologists love to ask and aspire to answer. Because evolutionary psychology is all about uncovering and elucidating the so-called psychic unity of humankind, and because of the considerable political and professional pressure to discover traits that conform to specific political agendas, readers need to be cautious about claims concerning such universals. Too often, the claims don't hold up to scrutiny. The supposed universality of human marriage and the linked omnipresence of the nuclear family is a case in point. A cornerstone of the standard model of human sexual evolution, the claim for this universal human tendency to marry appears to be beyond question or doubt, unquestioningly correct in Malinowski's words. Though the tendency has been assumed since before Darwin, evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers' now classic paper, Parental Investment in Sexual Selection, published in 1972, consolidated the position of marriage as foundational to most theories of human sexual evolution. Recall that marriage, as defined by these theories, represents the fundamental exchange underlying human sexual evolution. In his BBC television series The Human Animal, Desmond Morris flatly declares, "The pair bond is the fundamental condition of the human species." Michael Giglieri, biologist and protege of Jane Goodall, writes, "Marriage is the ultimate human contract. Men and women in all societies marry in nearly the same way. Marriage," continues Giglieri, "is normally a permanent mating between a man and a woman, with the woman nurturing the infants, while the man supports and defends them. The institution of marriage," he concludes, "is older than states, churches, and laws." Oh my. The fundamental condition? The ultimate human contract? Hard to argue with that. But let's try, because slippery use of the word marriage in the anthropological literature has resulted in a huge headache for anyone trying to understand how marriage and the nuclear family really fit into human nature, if at all. The word, we'll find, is used to refer to a whole slew of different relationships. In Female Choices, her survey of female primate sexuality, primatologist Meredith Small writes of the confusion that resulted when the term consortship drifted away from its original meaning, a striking parallel to the confusion over marriage. Small explains, "The word consortship was used initially to define the close male-female sexual bond seen in savanna baboons, and then usage of the word spread to the relationship of other mating pairs. This semantic leap, says Small, was a mistake. Researchers began to think that all primates form consortships, and they applied the word to any short or long, exclusive or non-exclusive mating. This is a problem because what was originally intended to describe a specific male-female association that lasted during the days surrounding ovulation became an all-inclusive word for mating. Once a female is described as being in consort, no one sees the importance of her regular copulations with other males. Biologist Joan Roughgarden has noted the same problematic application of present-day human mating ideals to animals. She writes, "Sexual selection's primary literature describes extra-pair parentage as cheating on the pair bond. The male is said to be cuckolded, offspring of extra-pair parentage are said to be illegitimate, and females who do not participate in extra-pair copulations are said to be faithful. This judgmental terminology," concludes Roughgarden, "amounts to applying a contemporary definition of Western marriage to animals. Indeed, when familiar labels are applied, supporting evidence becomes far more visible than counter-evidence in a psychological process known as confirmation bias. Once we have a mental model, we're much more likely to notice and recall evidence supporting our model than evidence against it. Contemporary medical researchers attempt to neutralize this effect by using double-blind methodology in all serious research, where neither the researcher nor the subject knows which pills contain the real medicine. Without a clear definition of what they're looking for, many anthropologists have found marriage wherever they've looked. George Murdoch, a central figure in American anthropology, asserted in his classic cross-cultural anthropological survey that the nuclear family is a universal human social grouping. He went on to declare that marriage is found in every human society. But as we've seen, researchers trying to describe human nature are highly susceptible to Flintstoneization, unconsciously tending to discover features that look familiar and thereby universalizing contemporary social configurations while inadvertently blocking insight into the truth. Journalist Louis Menand noted this tendency in a piece in The New Yorker, writing, "The sciences of human nature tend to validate the practices and preferences of whatever regime happens to be sponsoring them. In totalitarian regimes, dissidence is treated as mental illness. In apartheid regimes, interracial contact is treated as unnatural. In free market regimes, self-interest is treated as hardwired. Paradoxically, in each of these cases, so-called natural behavior has to be encouraged and unnatural aberrations punished. The now forgotten diseases drapetomania and dysesthesia ethiopica illustrate this point. Both were described in 1851 by Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a leading authority on the medical care of Negroes in Louisiana and a leading thinker in the pro-slavery movement. In his article, Diseases and Peculiarities of the Negro Race, Dr. Cartwright explained that drapetomania was the disease causing Negroes to run away, the absconding from service to their white owners, while dysesthesia ethiopica was characterized by habitude of and obtuse sensibility of the body. He noted that slave overseers often referred to this disease more simply as rascality. Despite high-minded claims to the contrary, often couched in language chosen to intimidate would-be dissenters, dysesthesia ethiopica, science all too often grovels at the feet of the dominant cultural paradigm. Another weakness of many of these studies is known as the translation paradox, the assumption that a word, marriage for instance, translated from one language to another, has an identical meaning. We can agree that birds sing and bees dance only as long as we remember that their singing and dancing has almost nothing in common with ours, from motivation to execution. We use identical words to signify very different behaviors. It's the same with marriage. People everywhere do pair off, even if just for a few hours, days, or years. Maybe they do it to share pleasure, to make babies, to please their families, to seal a political alliance or business deal, or just because they like each other. When they do, the resident anthropologist standing in the shadows of love says, "Aha, this culture practices marriage too. It's universal." But many of these relationships are as far from our sense of marriage as a string hammock is from Grandma's featherbed. Simply changing the jargon and referring to long-term pair bond rather than marriage is no better. As Donald Simmons put it, the lexicon of the English language is woefully inadequate to reflect accurately the texture of human experience. To shrink the present vocabulary to one phrase, pair bond, and to imagine that in so doing one is being scientific is simply to delude oneself. On matrimonial whoredom. Even if we overlook the ubiquitous linguistic confusion, people who consider themselves to be married can have strikingly different notions of what their marriage involves. The Ache of Paraguay say that a man and woman sleeping in the same hut are married. But if one of them takes his or her hammock to another hut, they're not married anymore. That's it. The original no-fault divorce. Among the Kungsan, also known as Juhuansi of Botswana, most girls marry several times before they settle into a long-term relationship. For the Curipaco of Brazil, marriage is a gradual, undefined process. One scientist who lived with them explains, when a woman comes to hang her hammock next to her man and cook for him, then some younger Curipaco say they are married, kainukana. But older informants disagree. They say they are married only when they have demonstrated that they can support and sustain each other. Having a baby and going through the fast together cements a marriage. In contemporary Saudi Arabia and Egypt, there is a form of marriage known as nikah misyar, normally translated as traveler's marriage. According to a recent article in Reuters, misyar appeals to men of reduced means, as well as men looking for a flexible arrangement. The husband can walk away from a misyar and can marry other women without informing his first wife. Wealthy Muslims sometimes contract misyar when on holiday to allow them to have sexual relations without breaching the tenets of their faith. Suhaila Zain al-Abidin of the International Union of Muslim Scholars in Medina said almost 80% of misyar marriages end in divorce. A woman loses all her rights. Even how often she sees her husband is decided by his moods, she said. In the Shia Muslim tradition, there is a similar institution called nikah muta, marriage for pleasure, in which the relationship is entered into with a preordained termination point, like a car rental. These marriages can last anywhere from a few minutes to several years. A man can have any number of temporary wives at the same time, in addition to his permanent wife. Often used as a religious loophole in which prostitution or casual sex can fall within the bounds of religious requirements, there is no paperwork or ceremony required. Is this, too, marriage? Apart from expectations of permanence or social recognition, what about virginity and sexual fidelity? Are they universal and integral parts of marriage, as parental investment theory would predict? No. For many societies, virginity is so unimportant, there isn't even a word for the concept in their language. Among the Canela, explained Crocker and Crocker, virginity loss is only the first step into full marriage for a woman. There are several other steps needed before the Canela society considers a couple to be truly married, including the young woman's gaining social acceptance through her service in a festival men's society. This premarital service includes sequential sex with 15 to 20 men. If the bride-to-be does well, she'll earn payments of meat from the men, which will be paid directly to her future mother-in-law on a festival day. Casilda Jetha, co-author of this book, conducted a World Health Organization study of sexual behavior among villagers in rural Mozambique in 1990. She found that the 140 men in her study group were involved with 87 women as wives, 252 other women as long-term sexual partners, and 226 additional women on an occasional basis, working out to an average of 4 ongoing sexual relationships per man, not counting the unreported casual encounters many of these men likely experienced as well. Among the Warau, a group living in the forests of Brazil, ordinary relations are suspended periodically and replaced by ritual relations, known as mamus. During these festivities, adults are free to have sex with whomever they like. These relationships are honorable and believed to have a positive effect upon any children that might result. In his fascinating profile of the Piraha, and a scientist who studies them, journalist John Colapinto reports that, though they do not allow marriage outside their tribe, they have long kept their gene pool refreshed by permitting their women to sleep with outsiders. Among the Siriano, it's common for brothers to marry sisters, forming an altogether different sort of Brady Bunch. The marriage itself takes place without any sort of ceremony or ritual. No exchanges of property or vows, not even a feast. Just rehang your hammocks next to the women's, and you're married, boys. This casual approach to what anthropologists call marriage is anything but unusual. Early explorers, whalers, and fur trappers of the frigid north found the Inuit to be jaw-droppingly hospitable hosts. Imagine their confused gratitude when they realized the village headman was offering his own bed, wife included, to the weary, freezing traveler. In fact, the welcome Knud Rasmussen and others had stumbled into was a system of spouse exchange central to Inuit culture, with clear advantages in that unforgiving climate. Erotic exchange played an important role in linking families from distant villages in a durable web of certain aid in times of crisis. Though the harsh ecology of the Arctic dictated a much lower population density than the Amazon, or even the Kalahari Desert, extra-pair sexual interaction helped cement bonds that offered the same insurance against unforeseen difficulties. None of this behavior is considered adultery by the people involved, but then adultery is as slippery a term as marriage. It's not just thy neighbor's wife who can lead a man astray, but thine own as well. A well-known moral guide of the Middle Ages, the Speculum Doctrinale, Mirror of Doctrine, written by Vincent of Beauvais, declared, "A man who loves his wife very much is an adulterer. Any love for someone else's wife, or too much love for one's own, is shameful." The author went on to advise, "The upright man should love his wife with his judgment, not his affections." Vincent of Beauvais would have enjoyed the company of Daniel Defoe of London, famous still as the author of Robinson Crusoe. Defoe scandalized Britain in 1727 with the publication of a non-fiction essay with the catchy title Conjugal Lewdness or Matrimonial Whoredom. Apparently, that title was a bit much. For a later edition, he toned it down to a treatise concerning the use and abuse of the marriage bed. This was no desert island adventure, but a moralizing lecture on the physical and spiritual dangers of enjoying sex with one's spouse. Defoe would have appreciated the Nayar people, native to southern India, who have a type of marriage that doesn't necessarily include any sexual activity at all, has no expectation of permanence, and no cohabitation. Indeed, the bride may never see the groom again once the marriage ritual has been performed. But since divorce is not permitted in this system, the stability of these marriages must be exemplary, according to the anthropological surveys. As these examples show, many qualities considered essential components of marriage in contemporary Western usage are anything but universal. Sexual exclusivity, property exchange, even the intention to stay together for long. None of these are expected in many of the relationships evolutionary psychologists and anthropologists insist on calling marriage. Now consider the confusion created by the words mate and mating. A mate sometimes refers to a sexual partner in a given copulation. Other times it refers to a partner in a recognized marriage with whom children are raised and all sorts of behavioral and economic patterns are established. To mate with someone could mean to join together till death do us part, or it could refer to nothing more than a quickie with Julio down by the schoolyard. When evolutionary psychologists tell us that men and women have different innate cognitive or emotional modules, which determine their reactions to a mate's infidelity, we suppose that this refers to a mate in a long-term relationship. But you never know. When we read sex differences in humans' mate selection criteria exist and persist because the mechanisms that mediate mate evaluation differ for men and women, and that a tendency to become sexually aroused by visual stimuli constitutes part of the mate selection process in men, we scratch our heads, wondering whether this is a discussion of how people choose that special someone to introduce to mom, or merely the immediate visceral response patterns heterosexual men often experience in the presence of an attractive woman. Given that men have shown these same response patterns in response to photographs, films, attractively attired mannequins, and a Noah's Ark of farm animals, none of which are available for marriage, it seems that this language must refer to sexual attraction alone, but we're not really sure. At what point does a mate become a mate with whom to mate? Chapter 9. Paternity Certainty, the crumbling cornerstone of the standard narrative. According to anthropologist Robert Edgerton, the Marine Anim people of Melanesia believed semen was essential to human growth and development. They also married quite young, and to assure the bride's fertility, she had to be filled with semen. On her wedding night, therefore, as many as 10 members of her husband's lineage had sexual intercourse with the bride, and if there were more men than this in the lineage, they had intercourse with her the next night. A similar ritual was repeated at various intervals throughout a woman's life. "Welcome to the family. Have you met my cousins?" Lest you think this a particularly unusual wedding celebration, it seems the ancestors of the Romans did something similar. Marriage was celebrated with a wedding orgy in which the husband's friends had intercourse with the bride, with witnesses standing by. Otto Kiefer, in his 1934 Sexual Life in Ancient Rome, explains that from the Roman perspective, natural and physical laws are alien and even opposed to the marriage tie. Accordingly, the woman who is entering marriage must atone to Mother Nature for violating her and go through a period of free prostitution in which she purchases the chastity of marriage by preliminary unchastity. In many societies, such unchaste shenanigans continue well beyond the wedding night. The Kulina of Amazonia have a ritual known as the Dutsee Bani Toi, the order to get meat. Don Pollock explains that the village women go in a group from household to household at dawn, singing to the adult men in each house, ordering them to go hunting. At each house, one or more women in the group step forward to bang on the house with a stick. They will serve as the sex partners of the men of the house that night if they are successful in their hunt. Women in the group are not allowed to select their own husband. What happens next is significant. Feigning reluctance, the men drag themselves from their hammocks and head off into the jungle, but before splitting up to hunt independently, they agree on a time and place outside the village to meet later, where they'll redistribute whatever they've bagged, thus ensuring that every man returns to the village with meat, guaranteeing extra pair sex for one and all. Yet another nail in the coffin of the standard narrative. Pollock's description of the hunter's triumphal return is beyond improvement. At the end of the day, the men return in a group to the village, where the adult women form a large semicircle and sing erotically provocative songs to the men, asking for their meat. The men drop their catch in a large pile in the middle of the semicircle, often hurling it down with dramatic gestures and smug smiles. After cooking the meat and eating, each woman retires with the man whom she selected as her partner for the sexual tryst. Kulina engage in this ritual with great humor and perform it regularly. We'll bet they do. Pollock kindly confirmed our hunch that the Kulina word for meat, bani, refers both to food and to what you're thinking it does, dear reader. Maybe marriage isn't a human universal, but the capacity for sexual double entendre just might be.
Love, Lust, and Liberty at Lugu Lake. There is not now, and never has been, a society in which confidence in paternity is so low that men are typically more closely related genetically to their sisters than to their wives' offspring. Happily promiscuous, non-possessive Rousseauian chimpanzees turned out not to exist. I am not convinced by the available evidence that such human beings exist either. Donald Simons, The Evolution of Human Sexuality.
Simons's bold declaration was an expression of faith in parental investment theory and the central importance of paternity certainty in human evolution. But Simons was dead wrong on both points. As he wrote those ill-fated words in the late 1970s, primatologists in jungles along the Congo River were learning that bonobos are precisely the happy, promiscuous, and non-possessive apes whose existence Simons declared impossible. And the Mwosuo, also referred to as Na or Nari, an ancient society in southwest China, are a society where paternity certainty is so low and inconsequential that men do indeed raise their sisters' children as their own.
Women and men should not marry, for love is like the seasons. It comes and goes. Yang Erja Namu, Mwosuo Woman.
In the mountains around Lugu Lake, near the border between China's Yunnan and Sichuan provinces, live about 56,000 people who enjoy a family system that has perplexed and fascinated travelers and scholars for centuries. The Mwosuo revere Lugu Lake as the mother goddess, while the mountain towering over it, Ganmo, is respected as the goddess of love. Their language is not written, being rendered in Dongba, the sole pictographic language still used in the world today. They have no words for murder, war, or rape. The Mwosuo's relaxed and respectful tranquility is accompanied by a nearly absolute sexual freedom and autonomy for both men and women. In 1265, Marco Polo passed through the Morsuo region and later recalled their unashamed sexuality, writing, "They do not consider it objectionable for a foreigner or any other man to have his way with their wives, daughters, sisters, or any other women in their home. They consider it a great benefit, in fact, saying that their gods and idols will be disposed in their favor and offer them material goods in great abundance. This is why they are so generous with their women toward foreigners." Many times, wrote Polo with a wink and a nudge, a foreigner has wallowed in bed for 3 or 4 days with a poor sap's wife. Macho Italian that he was, Polo completely misread the situation. He misinterpreted the women's sexual availability as a commodity controlled by the men, when in fact the most striking feature of the Morsuo system is the fiercely defended sexual autonomy of all adults, women as well as men. The Morsuo refer to their arrangement as sese, meaning walking. True to form, most anthropologists miss the point by referring to the Morsuo system as walking marriage, and including the Morsuo on their all-encompassing lists of cultures that practice marriage. The Morsuo themselves disagree with this depiction of their system. By any stretch of the imagination, sese are not marriages, says Yang Erche Namu, a Morsuo woman who published a memoir about her childhood along the shores of Mother Lake. All sese are of the visiting kind, and none involves the exchange of vows, property, the care of children, or expectations of fidelity. The Morsuo language has no word for husband or wife, preferring the word azu, meaning friend. The Morsuo are a matrilineal agricultural people, passing property and family name from mother to daughters, so the household revolves around the women. When a girl reaches maturity at about 13 or 14, she receives her own bedroom that opens both to the inner courtyard of the house and to the street through a private door. A Morsuo girl has complete autonomy as to who steps through this private door into her babahuago, flower room. The only strict rule is that her guest must be gone by sunrise. She can have a different lover the following night, or later that same night if she chooses. There is no expectation of commitment, and any child she conceives is raised in her mother's house with the help of the girl's brothers and the rest of the community. Recalling her childhood, Yang Erche Namu echoes Malidoma Patrice Somme's description of his African childhood, explaining, "We children could roam at our own will and visit from house to house and village to village without our mothers ever fearing for our safety. Every adult was responsible for every child, and every child in turn was respectful of every adult." Among the Morsuo, a man's sister's children are considered his paternal responsibility, not those who may or may not be the fruit of his own nocturnal visits to various flower rooms. Here we see another society in which male parental investment is unrelated to biological paternity. In the Morsuo language, the word awu translates to both father and uncle. In place of one father, Morsuo children have many uncles who take care of them. In a way, writes Yang Erche Namu, we also have many mothers because we call our aunts by the name Aseami, which means little mother. In a twist that should send many mainstream theorists into a tailspin, sexual relations are kept strictly separate from Morsuo family relations. At night, Morsuo men are expected to sleep with their lovers. If not, they sleep in one of the outer buildings, never in the main house with their sisters. Custom prohibits any talk of love or romantic relationships in the family home. Complete discretion is expected from everyone. While both men and women are free to do as they will, they're expected to respect one another's privacy. There's no kissing and telling at Lugu Lake. The mechanics of the Achia relationships, as they are referred to by Morsuo, are characterized by a sacred regard for each individual's autonomy, whether man or woman. Tsai Hua, a Chinese anthropologist and author of A Society Without Fathers or Husbands, explains, not only do men and women have the freedom to foster as many Achia relationships as they want and to end them as they please, but each person can have simultaneous relationships with several Asiya, whether it be during one night or over a longer period. These relationships are discontinuous, lasting only as long as the two people are in each other's presence. Each visitor's departure from the woman's home is taken to be the end of their Asiya relationship, according to Tsai Hua. There is no concept of Asiya that applies to the future. The Asiya relationship only exists instantaneously and retrospectively, although a couple may repeat their visits as often as they wish. Particularly libidinous Mosuo women and men unashamedly report having had hundreds of relationships. Shame, from their perspective, would be the proper response to promises of or demands for fidelity. A vow of fidelity would be considered inappropriate, an attempt at negotiation or exchange. Openly expressed jealousy for the Mosuo is considered aggressive in its implied intrusion upon the sacred autonomy of another person and is thus met with ridicule and shame. Sadly, hostility toward this free expression of female sexual autonomy is not limited to narrow-minded anthropologists and 13th century Italian explorers. Although the Mosuo have no history of trying to export their system or convincing anyone else of the superiority of their approach to love and sex, they have long suffered outside pressure to abandon their traditional beliefs, which outsiders seem to find threatening. Once the Chinese established full control of the area in 1956, government officials began making annual visits to lecture the people on the dangers of sexual freedom and convince them to switch to normal marriage. In a bit of dubious publicity reminiscent of reefer madness, Chinese government officials showed up one year with a portable generator and a film showing actors dressed as Mosuo who were in the last stages of syphilis, who had gone mad and lost most of their faces. The audience response was not what the Chinese officials expected. Their makeshift cinema was burned to the ground. But the officials didn't give up. Yang Erche Namu recalls meetings night after night where they harangued and criticized and interrogated. The Chinese officials ambushed men on their way to their lovers' houses, they dragged couples out of their beds, and exposed people naked to their own relatives' eyes. When even these heavy-handed tactics failed to convince the Mosuo to abandon their system, government officials insisted on bringing, if not demonstrating, decency to the Mosuo. They cut off essential deliveries of seed grain and children's clothing. Finally, literally starved into submission, many Mosuo agreed to participate in government-sponsored marriage ceremonies where each was given a cup of tea, a cigarette, pieces of candy, and a paper certificate. But the arm-twisting had little lasting effect. Travel writer Cynthia Barnes visited Lugu Lake in 2006 and found the Mosuo system still intact, though under pressure from Chinese tourists who, like Marco Polo 750 years earlier, mistake the sexual autonomy of Mosuo women for licentiousness. Although their lack of coyness draws the world's attention to the Mosuo, Barnes writes, sex is not the center of their universe. She continues, I think of my parents' bitter divorce, of childhood friends uprooted and destroyed because mommy or daddy decided to sleep with someone else. Lugu Lake, I think, is not so much a kingdom of women as a kingdom of family, albeit one blessedly free of politicians and preachers extolling family values. There's no such thing as a broken home, no sociologists wringing their hands over single mothers, no economic devastation or shame and stigma when parents part. Sassy and confident, a Mosuo girl will grow up cherished in a circle of male and female relatives. When she joins the dances and invites a boy into her flower room, it will be for love or lust or whatever people call it when they are operating on hormones and heavy breathing. She will not need that boy or any other to have a home, to make a family. She already knows that she will always have both. The Mosuo approach to love and sex may well finally be destroyed by the hordes of Han Chinese tourists who threaten to turn Lugu Lake into a theme park version of Mosuo culture. But the Mosuo's persistence in the face of decades, if not centuries, of extreme pressure to conform to what many scientists still insist is human nature stands as a proud, undeniable counterexample to the standard narrative. On the inevitability of patriarchy. Despite societies like the Mosuo's, in which women are autonomous and play crucial roles in maintaining social and economic stability, and plentiful evidence from dozens of foraging societies in which females enjoy high status and respect, many scientists rigidly insist that all societies are and always have been patriarchal. In Why Men Rule, originally titled The Inevitability of Patriarchy, sociologist Stephen Goldberg provides an example of this absolutist view, writing, "Patriarchy is universal. Indeed, of all social institutions, there is probably none whose universality is so totally agreed upon. There is not, nor has there ever been, any society that even remotely failed to associate authority and leadership in suprafamilial areas with the male. There are no borderline cases." Strong words. Yet in 247 pages, Goldberg fails to mention the Mosuo even once. Goldberg does mention the Minangkabau of West Sumatra, Indonesia, but only in an appendix where he cites two passages from others' research. The first, dating to 1934, says that men are generally served food before women. From this, Goldberg concludes that males wield superior power in Minangkabau society. This is as logically consistent as concluding that Western societies must be matriarchal because men often hold doors open for women, allowing them to pass first. The second passage Goldberg cites is from a paper co-authored by anthropologist Peggy Reeves Sanday, suggesting that the Minangkabau men have some degree of authority in the application of various aspects of traditional law. There are two big problems with Goldberg's application of Sanday's work. First, there is no inherent contradiction between claiming that a society is not patriarchal and yet that men do enjoy various types of authority. This is simply illogical. Van Gogh's famous painting The Starry Night is not a yellow painting, though there is plenty of yellow in it. The second problem with this citation is that Peggy Reeves Sanday, the anthropologist Goldberg cites, has consistently argued that the Minangkabau are matriarchal. In fact, her most recent book about the Minangkabau is called Women at the Center, Life in a Modern Matriarchy. Having spent over 20 summers living with the Minangkabau, Sanday says, "The power of Minangkabau women extends to the economic and social realms, noting, for example, that women control land inheritance and that a husband typically moves into the wife's household. The 4 million Minangkabau living in West Sumatra consider themselves to be a matriarchal society. While we in the West glorify male dominance and competition," Sanday says, "the Minangkabau glorify their mythical Queen Mother and cooperation." She reports that males and females relate more like partners for the common good than like competitors ruled by egocentric self-interest, and that, as with bonobo social groups, women's prestige increases with age and accrues to those who promote good relations. As happens so often in trying to understand and discuss other cultures, wording trips up specialists. When they claim never to have found a true matriarchy, these anthropologists are envisioning a mirror image of patriarchy, a vision that ignores the differing ways males and females conceptualize and wield power. Sanday says that among the Minangkabau, for example, neither male nor female rule is possible because of their belief that decision-making should be by consensus. When she kept asking people which sex ruled, she was finally told that she was asking the wrong question. Neither sex rules because males and females complement one another. Remember this when some loudmouth at the bar declares that patriarchy is universal and always has been. It's not, and it hasn't. But rather than feel threatened, we'd recommend that our male readers ponder this. Societies in which women have lots of autonomy and authority tend to be decidedly male-friendly, relaxed, tolerant, and plenty sexy. Got that, fellas? If you're unhappy at the amount of sexual opportunity in your life, don't blame the women. Instead, make sure they have equal access to power, wealth, and status. Then watch what happens. As with bonobos, where female coalitions are the ultimate social authority, and individual females need not fear the larger males, human societies in which women are sassy and confident, as Barnes described the Moswo girls, free to express their minds and sexuality without fear of shame or persecution, tend to be far more comfortable places for most men than societies ruled by a male elite. Maybe matriarchal societies are so difficult for Western male anthropologists to recognize because they expect a culture where men are suffering under the high heels of women, a reverse reflection of the long-standing male oppression of women in Western cultures. Instead, observing a society where most of the men are lounging about relaxed and happy, they conclude they found yet another patriarchy, thereby missing the point entirely.
The March of the Monogamous. The idea of monogamy hasn't so much been tried and found wanting as found difficult and left untried. G.K. Chesterton.
The surprise box office hit of 2005 was a film called March of the Penguins. The second biggest money-making documentary to date, viewers were touched by its depiction of the extreme dedication penguin couples showed in nurturing their adorable penguin pups. Many viewers saw their own marriages reflected in the penguins' sacrifice for their offspring and for each other. As one reviewer put it, it's impossible to watch the thousands of penguins huddled together against the icy Antarctic blasts without feeling a tug of anthropomorphic kinship. Churches across the United States reserved cinemas for private screenings for their congregations. Rich Lowry, editor of the National Review, told a conference of young Republicans, "Penguins are the really ideal example of monogamy. The dedication of these birds is amazing." Adam Leipzig, president of National Geographic Feature Films, declared the penguins model parents, continuing, "What they go through to look after their children is phenomenal, and no parent who sees it will ever complain about the school run. There are parallels with human nature, and it's moving to see." But unlike the birds themselves, penguin sexuality is not all black and white. That perfect penguin pair, that ideal example of monogamy, those model parents, are monogamous only as long as it takes to get their little one out of the egg, off the ice, and into the frigid Antarctic water, a little less than a year. If you've seen the film, you know that with all the trekking back and forth across the windswept ice and huddling against raging Antarctic blizzards, there's not much in the way of extramarital temptation anyway. Once Junior is swimming with the other 11-month-olds, the penguin equivalent of kindergarten, fidelity is quickly forgotten, divorce is quick, automatic, and painless, and Mom and Dad are back on the penguin prowl. With a breeding adult typically living 30 years or more, these model parents have at least 24 families in a lifetime. Did someone say ideal example of monogamy? Whether you found the film to be cloyingly sweet or refreshingly so, a bold, if somewhat perverse double feature would pair The March of the Penguins with Werner Herzog's Encounters at the End of the World. Herzog's documentary of the Antarctic is a masterpiece of photography and interviews with a range of surprising characters, including Dr. David Ainley, an almost comically reserved marine ecologist who has been studying penguins in Antarctica for 2 decades. Under Herzog's wry questioning, Ainley reports having witnessed cases of penguin ménages à trois, in which 2 males take turns caring for a particular female's egg, as well as penguin prostitution, where females receive prime nest-building pebbles in exchange for a bit of penguin poontang. The prairie vole is another supposed paragon of natural monogamy. According to one newspaper article, prairie voles, squat rodents indigenous to plains and grasslands, are considered to be a near-perfect monogamous species. They form pair bonds that share a nest. Both male and female actively protect each other, their territory, and their young. The male is an active parent, and if one of the pair dies, the survivor does not take a new mate. Considering the vitriol Darwin faced 150 years ago, when he dared compare humans to apes, it's striking to note the scraps of comfort contemporary scientists find in equating human sexual behavior with that of the rat-like prairie vole. We who once compared ourselves to angels now see ourselves reflected in this lowly rodent. But C. Sue Carter and Lowell L. Getz, who have studied the biology of monogamy in prairie voles and other species for 35 years, are unambiguous. Sexual exclusivity, they write, is not a feature of the vole's monogamy. Thomas Insel, director of the National Institute of Mental Health, formerly director of Yerkes Primate Center and an expert on the prairie vole, says that those in the know have a less exalted view of the prairie vole's monogamy. They'll sleep with anyone, but they'll only sit by their partners. Then there's that line, invariably directed at women for some reason, that goes, "If you're looking for monogamy, marry a swan." Most famously in Nora Ephron's film Heartburn. So what about swans, then? Many species of birds have long been believed to be monogamous because two parents are needed for the 24/7 labor of incubating eggs and feeding nestlings. As with humans, investment-minded theorists assumed males would help out only if they were certain the young were their own. But the recent advent of affordable DNA testing has blown embarrassing holes in this story, too. Although a pair of bluebirds may build a nest and rear the young together, an average of 15 to 20% of the chicks are not sired by the male in the partnership, according to Patricia Adair Goety, a behavioral ecologist. And bluebirds aren't particularly slutty songbirds. DNA studies of the chicks of some 180 bird species previously thought to be monogamous have shown that about 90% of them aren't. Swans, alas, are not among the virtuous 10%. So if you're looking for monogamy, forget the swan, too.
Is monogamy natural? Yes. Human beings almost never have to be cajoled into pairing. Instead, we do this naturally. We flirt, we feel infatuation, we fall in love, we marry. And the vast majority of us marry only one person at a time. Pair bonding is a trademark of the human animal. Helen Fisher.
Strange trademark for a species that enjoys so much extra-pair sexual activity. The glue holding the standard narrative together is the assumption that to marry and to mate have universally applicable meanings, like the verbs to eat or to give birth. But whatever terminology we use for the socially approved special relationship that often exists between men and women around the world will never communicate the universe of variations our species comes up with. Marriage, mating, and love are socially construed phenomena that have little or no transferable meaning outside any given culture. The examples we've noted of rampant ritualized group sex, mate swapping, unrestrained casual affairs, and socially sanctioned sequential sex were all reported in cultures that anthropologists insist are monogamous simply because they've determined that something they call marriage takes place there. No wonder so many insist that marriage, monogamy, and the nuclear family are human universals. With such all-encompassing interpretations of the concepts, even the prairie vole, who sleeps with anyone, would qualify. Chapter 10. Jealousy, a beginner's guide to coveting thy neighbor's spouse.
Once marriage becomes common, jealousy will lead to the inculcation of female virtue, and this, being honored, will tend to spread to the unmarried females. How slowly it spreads to the male sex, we see at the present day. Charles Darwin. In a traditional Canela marriage ceremony, the bride and groom lie down on a mat, arms under each other's heads, legs entwined. The brother of each partner's mother then comes forward. He admonishes the bride and her new husband to stay together until the last child is grown, specifically reminding them not to be jealous of each other's lovers. Sarah Blaffer Hurdy.
A printer's error in 1631 resulted in Bibles that proclaimed, "Thou shalt commit adultery." Though not a biblical injunction, a common thread running through many of our examples of sex, socioerotic exchanges if you've forgotten, is the explicit prohibition against relations with one's habitual partners, sometimes even under threat of death. Why would that be? Since these rituals have developed in unrelated cultures throughout the world, they probably serve important functions. Internal conflict represented an existential threat to profoundly interdependent groups, like those in which our ancestors lived for thousands of generations. Ritualized, socially sanctioned, sometimes even obligatory sex reduced disruptions caused by jealousy and possessiveness while blurring paternity. It's not surprising that small-scale societies highly dependent upon trust between individuals, generosity, and cooperation evolve and promote ways of enhancing these qualities, while discouraging behavior and beliefs that would threaten group harmony and survival for group members. It bears repeating that we are not attributing any particular nobility, or for that matter, ignobility, to foragers. Some behaviors that seem normal to contemporary people, and which are therefore readily assumed to be universal, would quickly destroy many small-scale foraging societies, rendering them dysfunctional. Unrestrained self-interest in particular, whether expressed as food hoarding or excessive sexual possessiveness, is a direct threat to group cohesion and is therefore considered shameful and ridiculous. Is there any doubt that societies can reshape such impulses? Right now, girls' necks are being elongated ring by brass ring in parts of Thailand and Burma to make them more appealing to men. Clitorises are being cut away and labia sewn together in villages all over North Africa to dampen female desire, while in glamorous California, reduction labiaplasty and other cosmetic vaginal surgeries have recently become a booming business. Elsewhere, the penises of boys are being circumcised or split open in ritualistic subincision. You get the point. A few Native American tribes of the Upper Plains had an agreed-upon sense of beauty that led them to strap small planks of wood to their infants' still pliable foreheads. As the child grew, the straps would be tightened, as an orthodontist realigns a bite, bit by bit. It's unclear how much brain damage, if any, resulted from this practice, but the otherworldly conical heads that resulted scared the bejesus out of neighboring tribes and white fur trappers in the area. And that may well have been the point, if you will. If their otherworldly appearance gave them a protective advantage by scaring potential enemies, it's not hard to see how such a fashion statement could have evolved. From savoring saliva beer or cow blood milkshakes to wearing socks with sandals, there is little doubt that people are willing to think, feel, wear, do, and believe pretty much anything if their society assures them it's normal. Social forces that convince people to stretch their necks beyond the breaking point, smush the heads of their infants, or sell their daughters into sacred prostitution are quite capable of reshaping or neutralizing sexual jealousy by rendering it silly and ridiculous, by rendering it abnormal. The evolutionary explanation for male sexual jealousy, as we've seen, pivots on the genetic calculus underlying paternity certainty. But if it's a question of genes, a man should be far less concerned about his wife having sex with his brothers, who share half his genes, than with unrelated males. Gentlemen, would you be far less upset to find your wife in bed with your brother than with a total stranger? Ladies, would you prefer your husband have an affair with your sister? Didn't think so. Zero-sum sex. We mentioned David Buss in our discussion of mixed mating strategies earlier, but most of his work concerns the study of jealousy. Buss doesn't buy the notion of sharing food or mates, conceptualizing both in terms of scarcity. If there is not enough food to feed all members of a group, he writes, then some survive while others perish. Similarly, if two women desire the same man, one woman's success in attracting him is the other woman's loss. Buss has little doubt that evolution is a zero-sum game, with the victors winning at the expense of the losers. Far too often, the debate over the nature of human sexuality seems like a proxy war between antagonistic politico-economic philosophies. Defenders of the standard narrative see Cain's gain as Abel's loss, period. That's just how life is, kid, they'll tell you. It's human nature. Self-interest makes the world go round. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's a dog-eat-dog world and always has been. This free-market vision of human mating hinges on the assumption that sexual monogamy is intrinsic to human nature. Absent monogamy, individual male ownership of female reproductive capacity, the I win, you lose dynamic collapses. As we outlined above, Buss and his colleagues get around the many glaring flaws in the theory: our extravagant sexual capacity, ubiquitous adultery in all cultures, rampant promiscuity in both our closest primate relatives, the absence of any monogamous primate living in large social groups, with pretzel logic and special pleading about Homo sapiens' internally conflicted, self-defeating, mixed mating strategies. Twist and stretch. Buss and his colleagues have conducted scores of cross-cultural studies designed to confirm that men and women experience jealousy differently from each other in consistent gender-specific ways. These researchers claim to have confirmed two important assumptions underlying the standard narrative: that men are universally worried about paternity certainty, hence his mate's sexual fidelity is his main concern, while women are universally concerned with access to men's resources, so a woman will feel more threatened by any emotional intimacy that might inspire him to leave her for another woman. These gender-specific manifestations of sexual jealousy would appear to strongly support the standard narrative. In a study typical of this research, Buss and his colleagues asked 1,122 people to imagine their partner becoming interested in someone else. They asked, what would upset or distress you more? A. Imagining your partner forming a deep emotional but not sexual relationship with that person, or B. Imagining your partner enjoying a sexual but not emotional relationship with that person. In studies like this, conducted on college campuses around the United States and Europe, Buss and his colleagues consistently got more or less the same results. They found that men and women differed by roughly 35% in their responses, seeming to confirm their hypothesis. Women continued to express greater upset about a partner's emotional infidelity, Buss writes, even if it did not involve sex. Men continued to show more upset than women about a partner's sexual infidelity, even if it did not involve emotional involvement. But despite the apparent cross-cultural breadth of this research, it lacks methodological depth. Buss and his colleagues succumb to the same temptation that weakens so much sexuality research: reliance on a subject population more convenient than representative. Almost all the participants in these studies were university students. We understand that undergraduate students are low-hanging research fruit, easy for graduate students to locate and motivate by offering partial course credit for filling out a questionnaire, for example, but this does not make them valid representatives of human sexuality, far from it. Even in supposedly liberal Western cultures, college-age people are in the early stages of their socio-sexual development, with little if any experience to draw on when considering questions about one-night stands, long-term mate preferences, or their ideal number of lifetime sexual partners, all questions explored in Buss's research. But Buss is not alone in this distorting focus on undergrads. the majority of research on sexuality is based upon the responses of 18 to 22-year-old American university students. While one could make a case that a 20-year-old guy is more or less like a turbocharged 50-year-old, few would argue that a 20-year-old woman has much in common with a woman 3 decades older in terms of her sexuality. Most would agree that a woman's sexuality changes considerably throughout adulthood. Another problem with using college students in the sort of multicultural study Bus conducts concerns class distinctions. In underdeveloped countries, university students are likely to be from the upper classes. A wealthy Angolan student may have a lot more in common with a Portuguese undergrad than with someone his or her own age living in the slums of Luanda. Our own field research in Africa suggests that sexual beliefs and behavior differ greatly among social classes and subcultures there, as they do in other parts of the world. Beyond the distorting effects of age and class, Buss and his colleagues skip over the crucial fact that every one of their subjects lives in post-agricultural societies characterized by private property, political hierarchies, globalized television, and so on. How can we expect to identify human universals without including at least a few foragers whose thoughts and behaviors have not been shaped by the effects of modern life and whose perspective represents the vast majority of our species' experience? As we've established, plenty of research on foragers demonstrates important similarities among unrelated societies and dramatic differences from post-agricultural norms. Swedes and upper-class Nigerians may see themselves as different from one another, but from a forager's perspective, they would seem similar in many ways. Granted, it is no easy matter to airdrop questionnaires and number 2 pencils to foragers in the upper Amazon. The grad students must be crazy. Still, the difficulty or impossibility of including their perspective does nothing to lessen its vital importance to the integrity of this sort of research. This broad yet shallow research paradigm is like claiming to have uncovered universal fish truths after conducting studies in rivers around the world. What about the fish in lakes, ponds, oceans? Psychologist Christine Harris has noted that Buss's conclusions could easily be nothing more than confirmation of old news, that men are more reactive to any form of sexual stimuli than they are to emotional stimuli, and are more interested in or better able to imagine such stimuli. The men get more agitated by the sex, in other words, simply because they imagine it more clearly than the women do. When Harris measured the bodily responses of people being asked Buss's questions, she found that women as a group showed little difference in physiological reactivity, but they still predicted, almost unanimously, that the emotional infidelity would be more disturbing for them. This finding suggests a fascinating disconnect between what these women actually feel and what they think they should feel about their partner's fidelity. Psychologists David A. DiSteno and Peter Salovey found even more fundamental flaws in Buss's research, pointing out that the subject's belief system comes into play when answering questions about hypothetical infidelity. They note that the belief that emotional infidelity implies sexual infidelity was held to a greater degree by women than men, and that therefore the choice between sexual infidelity and emotional infidelity, at the heart of Buss's studies, is a false dichotomy. David A. Lishner and his colleagues honed in on another weak point. The fact that subjects are given only 2 options, either thoughts of sexual infidelity hurt more, or thoughts of emotional infidelity do. Lishner asked, what if both scenarios made subjects feel equally uncomfortable? When Lishner included this third option, he found that the majority of respondents indicated that both forms of infidelity were equally upsetting, throwing further doubt on Buss's conclusions. Buss and other evolutionary psychologists who argue that some degree of jealousy is part of human nature may have a point, but they're overplaying their hand when they universalize their findings to everyone, everywhere, always. Human nature is made of highly reflective material. It is a mirror, admittedly marked by unalterable genetic scratches and cracks, but a mirror nonetheless. For most human beings, reality is pretty much what we're told it is. Like practically everything else, jealousy reflects social modification and can clearly be reduced to little more than a minor irritant if consensus deems it so. Real science offers one of the few, if not the only, reliable means of seeing beyond such cultural distortions, which makes it vitally important that we be fearless in rooting out cultural bias in research. Among the Siriano of Bolivia, jealousy tends to arise not because one's spouse has lovers, but because he or she is devoting too much time and energy to those lovers. According to anthropologist Alan Holmberg, romantic love is a concept foreign to the Siriano. Sex, like hunger, is a drive to be satisfied. The expression sukubi, I like, is used in reference to everything the Siriano enjoy, whether food, jewelry, or a sexual partner. While there are, of course, certain ideals of erotic bliss, Holmberg found that, under conditions of desire, these readily break down, and the Siriano are content to conform to the principle of any port in a storm. Anthropologist William Crocker is convinced that Canela husbands are not jealous, writing, "Whether or not Canela husbands are telling the truth about not minding, they join with other members in encouraging their wives to honor the custom of ritual sex with 20 or more men during all community ceremonies." Now, anyone who can pretend not to be jealous as his wife has sex with 20 or more men is someone you do not want to meet across a poker table. The cultures we've reviewed, from steamy jungles in Brazil to lakeside Himalayan foothills, have each developed mechanisms for minimizing jealousy and sexual possessiveness. But the opposite also happens. Some cultures actively encourage the impulse toward possessiveness. How to tell when a man loves a woman. Written by Percy Sledge and first recorded in 1966, When a Man Loves a Woman hit a cultural nerve. The song shot to the top of both the Billboard Hot 100 and R&B charts. Another version, recorded 25 years later by Michael Bolton, also went straight to the top of the charts, and the song now sits at number 54 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. Nothing is more prominent than love and sex in Western media, and When a Man Loves a Woman is an example of the message whispered in romantic ears throughout the world. What does Mr. Sledge have to say about a man's love for a woman? What are the signs of true masculine love? Copyright restrictions won't allow us to quote the song's lyric in full, but most readers know the words by heart anyway. To review, when a man loves a woman, he becomes obsessed and can't think of anything else. He'll exchange anything, even the world, for her company. He's blind to any fault she may have, and will abandon even his closest friend if that friend tries to warn him about her. He'll spend all his money trying to hold her attention. And, last but not least, he'll sleep in the rain if she tells him to. We'd like to suggest an alternative title for this song. When a man becomes pathologically obsessed and sacrifices all self-respect and dignity by making a complete ass of himself and losing the woman anyway, because really, who wants a boyfriend who sleeps out in the rain because someone told him to? Similarly, Every Breath You Take sits at a respectable number 84 on Rolling Stone's list of all-time great songs. One of the biggest hits of 1983, the song topped the UK charts for a month and the US charts for 2. It won Song of the Year, and the Police won that year's Grammy for Best Pop Performance. To date, the song has logged in over 10 million registered airplays on radio stations around the world. Again, we're assuming you know the words, but have you ever really listened to them? Though often held up as one of the great love songs of all time, Every Breath You Take is not about love at all. Sung from the perspective of a man who's been rejected by a woman who refuses to acknowledge that she belongs to him, he says he's going to follow her every step, watch her every move, see who she spends the night with, and so on. This is a love song? It should be #1 on Billboard's ranking of crazed and dangerous stalker songs. Even Sting, who wrote the song after awakening in the middle of the night with the line, "Every breath you take, every move you make," bubbled up from his subconscious, didn't realize until later how sinister the song is. He suggested in an interview that he may have been thinking of George Orwell's 1984, a novel about surveillance and control. Certainly not love. So is jealousy natural? It depends. Fear is certainly natural, and like any other kind of insecurity, jealousy is an expression of fear. But whether or not someone else's sex life provokes fear depends on how sex is defined in a given society, relationship, and individual's personality. Firstborn children often feel jealous when a younger sibling is born. Wise parents make a special point of reassuring the child that she'll always be special, that the baby doesn't represent any kind of threat to her status, and that there's plenty of love for everyone. Why is it so easy to believe that a mother's love isn't a zero-sum proposition, but that sexual love is a finite resource? Evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins asks the pertinent question with characteristic elegance. Is it so very obvious that you can't love more than one person? We seem to manage it with parental love. Parents are reproached if they don't at least pretend to love all their children equally. Love of books, of food, of wine. Love of Chateau Margaux does not preclude love of a fine hawk, and we don't feel unfaithful to the red when we dally with the white. Love of composers, poets, holiday beaches, friends. Why is erotic love the one exception that everybody instantly acknowledges without even thinking about it? Why indeed? How would the prevalence and experience of jealousy be affected in Western societies if the economic dependence trapping most women and their children didn't exist, leading female sexual access to be a tightly controlled commodity? What if economic security and guilt-free sexual friendships were easily available to almost all men and women, as they are in many of the societies we've discussed, as well as among our closest primate cousins? What if no woman had to worry that a ruptured relationship would leave her and her children destitute and vulnerable? What if average guys knew they'd never have to worry about finding someone to love? What if we didn't all grow up hearing that true love is obsessive and possessive? What if, like the Mwosuo, we revered the dignity and autonomy of those we loved? What if, in other words, sex, love, and economic security were as available to us as they were to our ancestors? If fear is removed from jealousy, what's left?
Human beings will be happier. Not when they cure cancer, or get to Mars, or eliminate racial prejudice, or flush Lake Erie, but when they find ways to inhabit primitive communities again. That's my utopia. Kurt Vonnegut, Jr.
According to E.O. Wilson, all that we can surmise of humankind's genetic history argues for a more liberal sexual morality, in which sexual practices are to be regarded first as bonding devices and only second as a means for procreation. We couldn't have said it better. But if human sexuality developed primarily as a bonding mechanism, in interdependent bands where paternity certainty was a non-issue, then the standard narrative of human sexual evolution is toast. The anachronistic presumption that women have always bartered their sexual favors to individual men in return for help with childcare, food, protection, and the rest of it, collapses upon contact with the many societies where women feel no need to negotiate such deals. Rather than a plausible explanation for how we got to be the way we are, the standard narrative is exposed as contemporary moralistic bias, packaged to look like science, and then projected upon the distant screen of prehistory, rationalizing the present while obscuring the past. Yabba dabba doo.
This audiobook has been broken into multiple parts to make the download faster.
This is Audible.
And now, Part 2 of Sex at Dawn, written by Christopher Ryan and Casilda Jetha, and read by Allison Johnson and Jonathan Davis.
Part 3. The Way We Weren't. A central theme in our argument is that human sexual behavior is a reflection of both evolved tendencies and social context. Thus, a sense of the day-to-day social world in which human sexual tendencies evolved is essential to understanding them. It's hard to imagine the communal, cooperative, social configurations we've described surviving long in the kind of world Hobbes envisioned, characterized by bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all. But the false view of prehistoric human life summed up in Hobbes's pithy dictum, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, is still almost universally accepted. Having established that prehistoric human life was highly social and decidedly not solitary, we now briefly address the other elements in Hobbes's description in the following 4 chapters, before continuing with a more direct discussion of overtly sexual material. We hope readers primarily interested in sex will bear with us, because what might at first seem a detour is in fact a shortcut to a clearer vision of the day-to-day lives of our ancestors, a vision that will help you make better sense of the material that follows, as well as of your own world. Chapter 11. The Wealth of Nature. Poor?
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed, in all of its forms, has marked the upward surge of mankind. Gordon Gekko, in the film Wall Street. What constitutes misuse of the universe? This question can be answered in one word. Greed. Greed constitutes the most grievous wrong. Laurenti Magesa. African Religion. The Moral Traditions of Abundant Life.
Economics, the dismal science, was dismal right from the start. On a late autumn afternoon in 1838, what may have been the brightest bolt of illumination ever to flash out of an overcast English sky struck Charles Darwin right upside the head, leaving him stunned by what Richard Dawkins has called the most powerful idea that has ever occurred to a man. At the very moment the great insight underlying natural selection came to him, Darwin was reading An Essay on the Principle of Population by Thomas Malthus. If the measure of an idea is its endurance through time, Thomas Malthus deserves his spot as Wikipedia's 80th most influential person in history. More than 2 centuries later, one would be hard-pressed to find a single student of economics unfamiliar with the simple argument put forth by the world's first professor of economics. You'll recall that Malthus argued that each generation doubles geometrically, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, but farmers can only increase food supply arithmetically, as new fields are cleared and productive capacity is added in a linear fashion, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. From this crystalline reasoning follows Malthus's brutal conclusion: chronic overpopulation, desperation, and widespread starvation are intrinsic to human existence, not a thing to be done about it. Helping the poor is like feeding London's pigeons. They'll just reproduce back to the brink of starvation anyway, so what's the point? The poverty and misery which prevail among the lower classes of society, Malthus asserts, are absolutely irremediable. Malthus based his estimates of human reproductive rates on the recorded increase of European population in North America in the previous 150 years, 1650 through 1800. He concluded that the colonial population had doubled every 25 years or so, which he took to be a reasonable estimate of the rates of human population growth in general. In his autobiography, Darwin recalled that when he applied these dire Malthusian computations to the natural world, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. Here, then, I had at last got a theory by which to work. Science writer Matt Ridley believes Malthus taught Darwin the bleak lesson that overbreeding must end in pestilence, famine, or violence, convincing him that the secret of natural selection was embedded in the struggle for existence. Thus was Darwin's brilliance sparked by the darkest Malthusian gloom. Alfred Russel Wallace, who came up with the mechanism underlying natural selection independently of Darwin, experienced his own flash of insight while reading the same essay between bouts of fever in a hut on the banks of a malarial Malaysian river. Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw smelled the Malthusian morbidity underlying natural selection, lamenting, "When its whole significance dawns on you, your heart sinks into a heap of sand within you." Shaw lamented natural selection's hideous fatalism and complained of its damnable reduction of beauty and intelligence, of strength and purpose, of honor and aspiration. But while Darwin and Wallace made excellent use of the Malthus's dire calculations, there's a problem with them. They don't add up.
The tribes of hunters, like beasts of prey, whom they resemble in their mode of subsistence, will be thinly scattered over the surface of the earth. Like beasts of prey, they must either drive away or fly from every rival, and be engaged in perpetual contests with each other. The neighboring nations live in a perpetual state of hostility with each other. The very act of increasing in one tribe must be an act of aggression against its neighbors, as a larger range of territory will be necessary to support its increased numbers. The life of the victor depends on the death of the enemy. Thomas Malthus. An essay on the principle of population.
If his estimates of population growth were even close to correct, Malthus, and thus Darwin, would have been right to assume that human societies had long been necessarily confined in room, resulting in a perpetual state of hostility with one another. In Descent of Man, Darwin revisits Malthus's calculations, writing, "Civilized populations have been known under favorable conditions, as in the United States, to double their numbers in 25 years. At this rate, the present population of the United States, 30 millions, would in 657 years cover the whole terraqueous globe so thickly that 4 men would have to stand on each square yard of surface." If Malthus had been correct about prehistoric human population doubling every 25 years, these assumptions would indeed have been reasonable. But he wasn't, and they weren't. We now know that until the advent of agriculture, our ancestors' overall population doubled not every 25 years, but every 250,000 years. Malthus, and thus Darwin after him, was off by a factor of 10,000. Malthus assumed the suffering he saw around him reflected the eternal, inescapable condition of human and animal life. He didn't understand that the teeming, desperate streets of London circa 1800 were far from a reflection of prehistoric conditions. A century and a half earlier, Thomas Hobbes had made the same mistake, extrapolating from his own personal experience to conjure a mistaken vision of prehistoric human life. Thomas Hobbes was born to terror. His mother had gone into premature labor upon hearing that the Spanish Armada was about to attack England. "My mother," Hobbes wrote many years later, "gave birth to twins, myself and fear." Leviathan, the book in which he famously asserts that prehistoric life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, was composed in Paris, where he was hiding from enemies he'd made by supporting the crown in the English Civil War. The book was nearly abandoned when he was taken with a near-fatal illness that left him at death's door for 6 months. Upon publication of Leviathan in France, Hobbes's life was now being threatened by his fellow exiles, who were offended by the anti-Catholicism expressed in the book. He fled back across the Channel to England, begging the mercy of those he'd escaped 11 years earlier. Though he was permitted to stay, publication of his book was prohibited. The church banned it, Oxford University banned and burned it. Writing of Hobbes's world, cultural historian Mark Lilla describes Christians addled by apocalyptic dreams, who hunted and killed Christians with a maniacal fury they had once reserved for Muslims, Jews, and heretics. It was madness. Hobbes took the madness of his age, considered it normal, and projected it back into prehistoric epochs of which he knew next to nothing. What Hobbes called human nature was a projection of 17th century Europe, where life for most was rough, to put it mildly. Though it has persisted for centuries, Hobbes's dark fantasy of prehistoric human life is as valid as grand conclusions about Siberian wolves based on observations of stray dogs in Tijuana. To be fair, Malthus, Hobbes, and Darwin were constrained by the lack of actual data. To his enormous credit, Darwin recognized this and tried hard to address it, spending his entire adult life collecting specimens, taking copious notes, and corresponding with anyone who could provide him with useful information, but it wasn't enough. The necessary facts wouldn't be revealed for many decades. But now we have them. Scientists have learned to read ancient bones and teeth, to carbon date the ash of Pleistocene fires, to trace the drift of the mitochondrial DNA of our ancestors, and the information they've uncovered resoundingly refutes the vision of prehistory Hobbes and Malthus conjured and Darwin swallowed whole.
Poor, pitiful me. We are enriched not by what we possess, but by what we can do without. Immanuel Kant.
If George Orwell was correct that those who control the past control the future, what of those who control the distant past? Prior to the population increases associated with agriculture, most of the world was a vast, empty place in terms of human population. But the desperate overcrowding imagined by Hobbes, Malthus, and Darwin is still deeply embedded in evolutionary theory and repeated like a mantra, facts be damned. For example, in his recent essay entitled Why War?, philosopher David Livingstone Smith projects the Malthusian panorama in all its mistaken despair. Competition for limited resources is the engine of evolutionary change, he writes. Any population that reproduces without inhibition will eventually outstrip the resources upon which it depends, and, as numbers swell, individuals will have no alternative but to compete more and more desperately for dwindling resources. Those who can secure them will flourish, and those who cannot will die. True, as far as it goes, but it doesn't go very far, because Smith forgets that our ancestors were the original ramblin' men and women, nomads who rarely stopped walking for more than a few days at a stretch. Walking away is what they did best. Why assume they would have stuck around to struggle desperately in an overpopulated area with depleted resources when they could simply walk up the beach as they'd been doing for uncounted generations? And prehistoric human beings never reproduced without inhibition like rabbits. Far from it. In fact, prehistoric world population growth is estimated to have been well below 0.001% per year throughout prehistory, hardly the population bomb Malthus assumed. Basic human reproductive biology in a foraging context made rapid population growth unlikely, if not impossible. Women rarely conceive while breastfeeding, and without milk from domesticated animals, hunter-gatherer women typically breastfeed each child for 5 or 6 years. Furthermore, the demands of a mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle make carrying more than one small child at a time unreasonable for a mother, even assuming lots of help from others. Finally, low body fat levels result in much later menarche for hunter-gatherer females than for their post-agricultural sisters. Most foragers don't start ovulating until their late teens, resulting in a shorter reproductive life. Hobbes, Malthus, and Darwin were themselves surrounded by the desperate effects of population saturation, rampant infectious disease, ceaseless war, Machiavellian struggles for power. The prehistoric world, however, was sparsely populated where it was populated at all. Other than isolated pockets surrounded by desert, or islands like Papua New Guinea, the prehistoric world was almost all open frontier. Most scholars believe that our ancestors were just setting out from Africa about 50,000 years ago, entering Europe 5 or 10,000 years later. The first human footprints probably weren't left on North American soil until about 12,000 years ago. During the many millennia before agriculture, the entire number of Homo sapiens on the planet probably never surpassed 1 million people, and certainly never approached the current population of Chicago. Furthermore, recently obtained DNA analyses suggest several population bottlenecks caused by environmental catastrophes reduced our species to just a few hundred individuals as recently as 70,000 years ago. Ours is a very young species. Few of our ancestors faced the unrelenting scarcity-generated selective pressures envisioned by Hobbes, Malthus, and Darwin. The ancestral human journey did not, by and large, take place in a world already saturated with our kind, fighting over scraps. Rather, the route taken by the bulk of our ancestors led through a long series of ecosystems with nothing quite like us already there. Like the Burmese pythons recently set loose in the Everglades, cane toads spreading unchecked across Australia, or the timber wolves recently reintroduced to Yellowstone, our ancestors were generally entering an open ecological niche. When Hobbes wrote that man to man is an errant wolf, he was unaware of just how cooperative and communicative wolves can be if there's enough food for everyone. Individuals in species spreading into rich new ecosystems aren't locked in a struggle to the death against one another. Until the niche is saturated, such interspecies conflict over food is counterproductive and needless. We've already shown that even in a largely empty world, the social lives of foragers were anything but solitary. But Hobbes also claimed prehistoric life was poor, and Malthus believed poverty to be eternal and inescapable. Yet most foragers don't believe themselves to be impoverished, and there's every indication that life wasn't generally much of a struggle for our fire-controlling, highly intelligent ancestors bound together in cooperative bands. To be sure, occasional catastrophes such as droughts, climatic shifts, and volcanic eruptions were devastating, but most of our ancestors lived in a largely unpopulated world chock full of food. For hundreds of thousands of generations, the omnivore's dilemma facing our ancestors lay in choosing among many culinary options. Plants eat soil, deer eat plants, cougars eat deer. But people can and do eat almost anything, including cougars, deer, plants, and, yes, even soil.
The despair of millionaires. Poverty is the invention of civilization. Marshall Sahlins.
A recent New York Times article under the headline, "In Silicon Valley, Millionaires Who Don't Feel Rich," begins, by almost any definition, except his own and perhaps those of his neighbors here in Silicon Valley, Hal Steger has it made. The article notes that although Mr. Steger and his wife have a net worth of roughly $3.5 million, he still typically works 12-hour days plus another 10 hours on weekends. A few million, explains Steger, doesn't go as far as it used to. Gary Kremen, estimated net worth $10 million, founder of Match.com, an online dating service, explains, "Everyone around here looks at the people above them." He continues to work 60 to 80 hours per week because he says, "You're nobody here at $10 million. Another executive gets right to the point saying, "Here, the top 1% chases the top 1/10 of 1%, and the top 1/10 of 1% chases the top 1/100th of 1%. This sort of thinking isn't limited to Silicon Valley. A BBC report from September 2003 reported, "Well off is the new poor." Dr. Clive Hamilton, a visiting scholar at Cambridge University, set out to study the suffering rich and found that 4 of every 10 people earning over £50,000, roughly $80,000 at the time, felt deprived. Hamilton concluded, "The real concerns of yesterday's poor have become the imagined concerns of today's rich." Another recent survey in the United States found that 45% of those with a net worth, excluding their home, over $1 million, were worried about running out of money before they died. Over 1/3 of those with more than $5 million had the same concern. Affluenza, aka luxury fever, is not an eternal affliction of the human animal, as some would have us believe. It is an effect of wealth disparities that arose with agriculture. Still, even in modern societies, we sometimes find echoes of the ancient egalitarianism of our ancestors. In the early 1960s, a physician named Stuart Wolfe heard about a town of Italian immigrants and their descendants in northeast Pennsylvania where heart disease was practically unknown. Wolfe decided to take a closer look at the town, Roseto. He found that almost no one under age 55 showed symptoms of heart disease. Men over 65 suffered about half the number of heart problems expected of average Americans. The overall death rate in Roseto was about 1/3 below national averages. After conducting research that carefully excluded factors such as exercise, diet, and regional variables like pollution levels, Wolfe and sociologist John Brunn concluded that the major factor keeping folks in Roseto healthier longer was the nature of the community itself. They noted that most households held 3 generations, that older folks commanded great respect, and that the community disdained any display of wealth, showing a fear of ostentation derived from an ancient belief among Italian villagers relating to malocchio, the evil eye. Children, Wolfe wrote, were taught that any display of wealth or superiority over a neighbor would bring bad luck. Noting that Roseto's egalitarian social bonds were already breaking down in the mid-1960s, Wolfe and Brunn predicted that within a generation, the town's mortality rates would start to shift upward. In follow-up studies they conducted 25 years later, they reported, "The most striking social change was a widespread rejection of a long-standing taboo against ostentation, and that sharing, once typical of Roseto, had given way to competition. Rates of both heart disease and stroke had doubled in a generation." Among foragers, where property is shared, poverty tends to be a non-issue. In his classic book, Stone Age Economics, anthropologist Marshall Solins explains that the world's most primitive people have few possessions, but they are not poor. Poverty is not a certain small amount of goods, nor is it just a relation between means and ends. Above all, it is a relation between people. Poverty is a social status. As such, it is the invention of civilization. Socrates made the same point 2,400 years ago. He is richest who is content with least, for contentment is the wealth of nature. But the wealth of civilization is material. After reading every word of the Old Testament, journalist David Plotz was struck by its mercantile tone. "The overarching theme of the Bible," he wrote, particularly of Genesis, is real estate. God is constantly making land deals and then remaking them on different terms. It's not just land that the Bible is obsessed with, but also portable property, gold, silver, livestock. Malthus and Darwin were both struck by the characteristic egalitarianism of foragers, the former writing, Among most of the American tribes, so great a degree of equality prevailed that all the members of each community would be nearly equal sharers in general hardships of savage life and in the pressure of occasional famines. For his part, Darwin recognized the inherent conflict between the capital-based civilization he knew and what he saw as the natives' self-defeating generosity, writing, "Nomadic habits, whether over wide plains or through the dense forests of the tropics or along the shores of the sea, have in every case been highly detrimental. The perfect equality of all the inhabitants," he wrote, "will for many years prevent their civilization." Finding contentment at the bottom of the scale of human beings. Looking for an example of the world's most downtrodden, pathetic, desperately poor savages, Malthus cited the wretched inhabitants of Tierra del Fuego, who had been judged by European travelers to be at the bottom of the scale of human beings. Just 30 years later, Charles Darwin was in Tierra del Fuego observing these same people. He agreed with Malthus concerning the Fuegians, writing in his journal, "I believe, if the world was searched, no lower grade of man could be found." As chance would have it, Captain Robert Fitzroy of the Beagle, the ship on which Darwin was sailing, had picked up 3 young Fuegians on an earlier voyage and brought them back to England to introduce them to the glories of British life and a proper Christian education. Now, after they'd experienced firsthand the superiority of civilized living, Fitzroy was returning them to their own people to serve as missionaries. The plan was for them to show the Fuegians the folly of their savage ways and help them join the civilized world. But just a year after Jemmy, York, and Fuegia had been returned to their people at Woollya Cove, near the base of what is now called Mount Darwin, the Beagle and her crew returned to find the huts and gardens the British sailors had built for the 3 Fuegians deserted and overgrown. Eventually, Jemmy appeared and explained that he and the other Christianized Fuegians had reverted to their former way of living. Darwin, overcome with sadness, wrote in his journal that he'd never seen so complete and grievous a change, and that it was painful to behold him. They brought Jemmy aboard the ship and dressed him for dinner at the captain's table, much relieved to see that he at least remembered how to use a knife and fork properly. Captain Fitzroy offered to bring him back to England, but Jemmy declined, saying he had not the least wish to return to England, as he was happy and contented with plenty fruits, plenty fish, and plenty birdies. Remember the Yucatan. What looks like even extreme poverty, the bottom of the scale of human beings, may contain unrecognizable forms of wealth. Recall the starving Australian Aboriginal people happily roasting low-fat rats and noshing on juicy grubs as revolted Englishmen looked on, certain they were witnessing the last demented spasms of starvation. When we start detribalizing, peeling away the cultural conditioning that distorts our vision, wealth and poverty may reveal themselves where we least expect to find them. Chapter 12. The Selfish Meme. Nasty? Richard Dawkins, author of The Selfish Gene, coined the term meme to refer to a unit of information that can spread through a community via learning or imitation the way a favored gene is replicated through reproduction. Just as egalitarianism and resource and risk-sharing memes were favored in the prehistoric environment, the selfishness meme has flourished in most of the post-agricultural world. Even so, no less an authority on economics than Adam Smith insisted that sympathy and compassion come to human beings as naturally as self-interest. The faulty assumption that scarcity-based economic thinking is somehow the de facto human approach to questions of supply, demand, and distribution of wealth has misled much anthropological, philosophical, and economic thought over the past few centuries. As economist John Gowdy explains, rational economic behavior is peculiar to market capitalism and is an embedded set of beliefs, not an objective universal law of nature. The myth of economic man explains the organizing principle of contemporary capitalism, nothing more or less.
Homo economicus. We have agreed with which we have agreed. Society, by Eddie Vedder.
Many economists have forgotten or never understood that their central organizing principle, Homo economicus, aka economic man, is a myth rooted in assumptions about human nature, not a bedrock truth upon which to base a durable economic philosophy. When John Stuart Mill proposed what he admitted to be an arbitrary definition of man as a being who inevitably does that by which he may obtain the greatest amount of necessaries, conveniences, and luxuries, with the smallest quantity of labor and physical self-denial, it's doubtful he expected his arbitrary definition to delimit economic thought for centuries. Recall Rousseau's words, "If I had had to choose my place of birth, I would have chosen a state in which everyone knew everyone else, so that neither the obscure tactics of vice nor the modesty of virtue could have escaped public scrutiny and judgment." Those who proclaim that greed is simply part of human nature too often leave context unmentioned. Yes, greed is part of human nature, but so is shame, and so is generosity, and not just toward genetic relatives. When economists base their models on their fantasies of an economic man motivated only by self-interest, they forget community, the all-important web of meaning we spin around each other, the inescapable context within which anything truly human has taken place. One of the most cited thought experiments in game theory and economics is called the prisoner's dilemma. It presents such an elegant and simple model of reciprocity, some scientists refer to it as the E. coli of social psychology. Here's how it works. Imagine that two suspects are arrested, but the police don't have enough evidence for a conviction. After the prisoners are separated, each gets the same offer. If you testify against your partner and he remains silent, you'll go free and he'll get the full 10-year sentence. If he fesses up but you don't, you'll do the time while he walks free. If neither of you talks, you'll both get 6 months. If you both talk, you'll both do 5 years. Each prisoner must choose to snitch or remain silent. Each is told the other won't know about his decision. How will the prisoners respond? In the classic form of the game, participants almost always betray one another as each sees the benefit of quick betrayal. Talk first and walk away free. But take that theoretical conclusion to a prison anywhere in the world and ask what happens to rats. Theory finally caught up to reality when scientists decided to let players gain experience with the game and see whether their behavior changed over time. As Robert Axelrod explains in The Evolution of Cooperation, players soon learned that they had a better chance if they kept quiet and assumed that their partner would do the same. If their partner talked, he acquired a bad reputation and was punished in a tit-for-tat pattern. Over time, those players with the more altruistic approach flourished, while those who acted only in their individual short-term interest met serious problems. A shiv in the shower, maybe. The classic interpretation of the experiment took another blow when psychologist Gregory S. Burns and his colleagues decided to wire female players up to an MRI machine. Burns et al. Were expecting to find that subjects would react most strongly to being cheated when one tried to cooperate and the other snitched. But that's not what they found. The results really surprised us, Burns told Natalie Angier of the New York Times. The brain responded most energetically to acts of cooperation. The brightest signals arose in cooperative alliances and in those neighborhoods of the brain already known to respond to desserts, pictures of pretty faces, money, cocaine, and any number of licit and illicit delights. Analyzing the brain scans, Burns and his team found that when the women cooperated, two parts of the brain, both responsive to dopamine, were activated: the anteroventral striatum and the orbital frontal cortex. Both regions are involved in impulse control, compulsive behavior, and reward processing. Though surprised by what his team found, Burns found comfort in it. "It's reassuring," he said. "In some ways, it says that we're wired to cooperate with each other." The Tragedy of the Commons. First published in the prestigious journal Science in 1968, biologist Garrett Hardin's paper, The Tragedy of the Commons, is one of the most reprinted articles ever to appear in a scientific journal. The authors of a recent World Bank discussion paper called it the dominant paradigm within which social scientists assess natural resource issues, while anthropologist G.N. Appel says the paper has been embraced as a sacred text by scholars and professionals. Well into the 1800s, much of rural England was considered commons, property owned by the king but available to everyone, like the open range in the western United States before the advent of barbed wire fencing. Using the English commons as his model, Hardin purported to show what happens when a resource is communally owned. He reasoned that in a pasture open to all, each herdsman will try to keep as many cattle as possible. Though destructive to the pasture, the herdsman's selfishness makes good economic sense from his personal perspective. Hardin wrote, "The rational herdsman will conclude that the only sensible course for him to pursue is to add another animal to his herd. This is the only rational choice, because all will share the cost of the degradation to the land from overgrazing, while the profit gained from additional animals will be his alone. Since each individual herdsman will come to the same conclusion, the common ground will inevitably be overgrazed. Freedom in a commons," Hardin concluded, "brings ruin to us all." Like Malthus's thoughts on population growth relative to agricultural capacity, Hardin's argument was a hit because, 1, it features an A plus B equals C simplicity that appears to be inarguably correct, and 2, it is useful in justifying seemingly heartless decisions by entrenched powers. Malthus's essay, for example, was often cited by British business and political leaders to explain their inaction in the face of widespread poverty in Britain, including the famine of the 1840s, in which several million Irish people starved to death and millions more fled to the United States. Hardin's articulation of the folly of communal ownership has provided cover repeatedly to those arguing for the privatization of government services and the conquest of native lands. One other thing Hardin's elegant argument has in common with that of Malthus: it collapses on contact with reality. As Canadian author Ian Angus explains, Hardin simply ignored what actually happens in a real commons, self-regulation by the communities involved. Hardin missed the fact that in small rural communities where population density is low enough that each of the herdsmen knows the others, the actual case in the historical English commons and in ancestral foraging societies, any individual who tries to game the system is quickly found out and punished. Nobel Prize-winning economist Elinor Ostrom's studies of commons management in small-scale communities led her to conclude that all communities have some form of monitoring to guard against cheating or using more than a fair share of the resource. Despite how it's been spun by economists and others arguing against local resource management, the real tragedy of the commons doesn't pose a threat to resources controlled by small groups of interdependent individuals. Forget the commons. We need to confront the tragedies of the open seas, skies, rivers, and forests. Fisheries around the world are collapsing because no one has the authority, power, and motivation to stop international fleets from strip mining waters everybody, and thus nobody, owns. Toxins from Chinese smokestacks burning illegally mined Russian coal lodge in Korean lungs, while American cars burning Venezuelan petroleum melt glaciers in Greenland. What allows these chain-linked tragedies is the absence of local, personal shame. The false certainty that comes from applying Malthusian economics, the prisoner's dilemma, and the tragedy of the commons to pre-agricultural societies requires that we ignore the fine-grained contours of life in small-scale communities where nobody could have escaped public scrutiny and judgment, in Rousseau's words. These tragedies become inevitable only when the group size exceeds our species' capacity for keeping track of one another, a point that's come to be known as Dunbar's number. In primate communities, size definitely matters. Noticing the importance of grooming behavior in social primates, British anthropologist Robin Dunbar plotted overall group size against the neocortical development of the brain. Using this correlation, he predicted that humans start losing track of who's doing what to whom when group size hits about 150 individuals. In Dunbar's words, the limit imposed by neocortical processing capacity is simply on the number of individuals with whom a stable interpersonal relationship can be maintained. Other anthropologists had arrived at the same number by observing that when group sizes grew much beyond that, they tend to split into two smaller groups. Writing several years before Dunbar's paper was published in 1992, Marvin Harris noted, "With 50 people per band, or 150 per village, everybody knew everybody else intimately, so that the bonding of reciprocal exchange could hold people together. People gave with the expectation of taking, and took with the expectation of giving." Recent authors, including Malcolm Gladwell in his best-selling The Tipping Point, have popularized the idea of 150 being a limit to organically functioning groups. Having evolved in small, intimate bands where everybody knows our name, human beings aren't very good at dealing with the dubious freedoms conferred by anonymity. When communities grow beyond the point where every individual has at least a passing acquaintance with everyone else, our behavior changes, our choices shift, and our sense of the possible and of the acceptable grows ever more abstract. The same argument can be made concerning the tragic misunderstanding of human nature that underlies communism. Community ownership doesn't work in large-scale societies where people operate in anonymity. In The Power of Scale, anthropologist John Bodley wrote, "The size of human societies and cultures matters because larger societies will naturally have more concentrated social power. Larger societies will be less democratic than smaller societies, and they will have an unequal distribution of risks and rewards." Right, because the bigger the society is, the less functional shame becomes. When the Berlin Wall came down, jubilant capitalists announced that the essential flaw of communism had been its failure to account for human nature. Well, yes and no. Marx's fatal error was his failure to appreciate the importance of context. Human nature functions one way in the context of intimate interdependent societies, but set loose in anonymity we become a different creature. Neither beast is more nor less human.
Dreams of perpetual progress. He is a barbarian, and thinks that the customs of his tribe and island are the laws of nature. George Bernard Shaw, Caesar, in Caesar and Cleopatra, Act 2.
Were we really born in the best possible time and place? Or is ours a random moment in infinity, just another among uncountable moments, each with its compensating pleasures and disappointments? Perhaps you find it absurd to even entertain such a question, to assume there's any choice in the matter, but there is. We all have a psychological tendency to view our own experience as standard, to see our community as the people, to believe, perhaps subconsciously, that we are the chosen ones, God is on our side, and our team deserves to win. To see the present in the most flattering light, we paint the past in blood-red hues of suffering and terror. Hobbes has been scratching this persistent psychological itch for several centuries now. It is a common mistake to assume that evolution is a process of improvement, that evolving organisms are progressing towards some final perfected state, but they, and we, are not. An evolving society or organism simply adapts over the generations to changing conditions. While these modifications may be immediately beneficial, they are not really improvements because external conditions never stop shifting. This error underlies the assumption that here and now is obviously better than there and then. 3.5 centuries later, scientists still quote Hobbes, telling us how lucky we are to live after the rise of the state, to have avoided the universal suffering of our barbaric past. It's deeply comforting to think we're the lucky ones, but let's ask the forbidden question: how lucky are we, really? Ancient poverty or assumed affluence? Prehistoric humans did not habitually store food, but this doesn't mean they lived in chronic hunger. Studies of prehistoric human bones and teeth show ancient human life was marked by episodic fasts and feasts, but prolonged periods of starvation were rare. How do we know our ancestors weren't living at the brink of starvation? When children and adolescents don't get adequate nutrition for as little as a week, growth slows in the long bones in their arms and legs. When their nutritional intake recovers and the bones begin to grow again, the density of the new bone growth differs from before the interruption. X-rays reveal these telltale lines in ancient bones, known as Harris lines. Periods of more prolonged malnutrition leave signs on the teeth known as hypoplasias, discolored bands and small pits in the enamel surface, which can still be seen many centuries later in fossilized remains. Archaeologists find fewer Harris lines and dental hypoplasias in the remains of prehistoric hunter-gatherer populations than they do in the skeletons of settled populations who lived in villages dependent on cultivation for their food supply. Being highly mobile, hunter-gatherers were unlikely to suffer from prolonged starvation, since in most cases they could simply move to areas where conditions were better. Approximately 800 skeletons from the Dixon Mounds in the lower Illinois Valley have been analyzed. They reveal a clear picture of the health changes that accompanied the shift from foraging to corn farming around 1200 AD. Archaeologist George Armalagos and his colleagues reported that the farmers' remains show a 50% increase in chronic malnutrition and 3 times the incidence of infectious diseases indicated by bone lesions compared with the foragers who preceded them. Furthermore, they found evidence of increased infant mortality, delayed skeletal growth in adults, and a 4-fold increase in porotic hyperostosis, indicating iron deficiency anemia in more than half the population. Many have noted the strangely cavalier approach to food among foragers who have nothing in the freezer. French Jesuit missionary Paul Lejeune, who spent some 6 months among the Montagnais in present-day Quebec, was exasperated by the natives' generosity. "If my host took 2, 3, or 4 beavers," wrote Lejeune, "whether it was day or night, they had a feast for all neighboring savages. And if those people had captured something, they had one also at the same time. So that on emerging from one feast, you went to another, and sometimes even to a third and a fourth." When Lejeune tried to explain the advantages of saving some of their food, they laughed at me. "Tomorrow," they said, "we shall make another feast with what we shall capture." Israeli anthropologist Nurit Bird-David explains, "Just as Westerners' behavior is understandable in relation to their assumption of shortage, so hunter-gatherers' behavior is understandable in relation to their assumptions of affluence. Moreover, just as we analyze, even predict, Westerners' behavior by presuming that they behave as if they did not have enough, so we can analyze, even predict hunter-gatherers' behavior by presuming that they behave as if they had it made. While farmers toil to grow rice, potatoes, wheat, or corn, a forager's diet is characterized by a variety of nutritious plants and critters. But how much work is foraging? Is it an efficient way to get a meal? Archaeologist David Madsen investigated the energy efficiency of foraging for Mormon crickets, Anabra simplex, which had been on the menu of the local native people in present-day Utah. His group collected crickets at a rate of about 18 crunchy pounds per hour. At that rate, Madsen calculated that in just an hour's work, a forager could collect the caloric equivalent of 87 chili dogs, 49 slices of pizza, or 43 Big Macs, without all the heart-clogging fats and additives. Before you scoff at the culinary appeal of Mormon crickets, give some thought to the frightening reality lurking within a typical chili dog. Another study found that the Kungsan, in the Kalahari Desert, mind you, had an average daily intake in a good month of 2,140 calories and 93 grams of protein. Marvin Harris puts it simply: Stone Age populations lived healthier lives than did most of the people who came immediately after them. And maybe healthier than people who came long after them, too. The castles and museums of Europe are full of suits of armor too small to fit any but the most diminutive of modern men. While our medieval ancestors were shrimpy by modern standards, archaeologist Timothy Taylor believes that the human ancestors who first controlled fire about 1.4 million years ago were taller than the average person today. Skeletons dug up in Greece and Turkey show that pre-agricultural men in those areas were about 5'9" on average, with women being about 5'5". But with the adoption of agriculture, average height plummeted. Modern Greeks and Turks still aren't as tall on average as their ancient ancestors. Throughout the world, the shift to agriculture accompanied a dramatic drop in the quality of most people's diets and overall health. Describing what he terms the worst mistake in human history, Jared Diamond writes, "Hunter-gatherers practiced the most successful and longest-lasting lifestyle in human history. In contrast," he concludes, "we're still struggling with the mess into which agriculture has tumbled us, and it's unclear whether we can solve it." On Paleolithic politics. Prehistoric life involved a lot of napping. In his provocative essay, The Original Affluent Society, Solons notes that among foraging people, the food quest is so successful that half the time the people do not seem to know what to do with themselves. Even Australian Aborigines living in apparently unforgiving and empty country had no trouble finding enough to eat, as well as sleeping about 3 hours per afternoon in addition to a full night's rest. Richard Lee's research with Kungsan Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert in Botswana indicates that they spend only about 15 hours per week getting food. A woman gathers on one day enough food to feed her family for 3 days and spends the rest of her time resting in camp, doing embroidery, visiting other camps, or entertaining visitors from other camps. For each day at home, kitchen routines such as cooking, nut-cracking, collecting firewood, and fetching water occupy 1 to 3 hours of her time. This rhythm of steady work and steady leisure is maintained throughout the year. A day or two of light work followed by a day or two off. How's that sound? Because food is found in the surrounding environment, no one can control another's access to life's necessities in hunter-gatherer society. Harris explains that in this context. Egalitarianism is firmly rooted in the openness of resources, the simplicity of the tools of production, the lack of non-transportable property, and the labile structure of the band. When you can't block people's access to food and shelter, and you can't stop them from leaving, how can you control them? The ubiquitous political egalitarianism of foraging people is rooted in this simple reality. Having no coercive power, leaders are simply those who are followed, individuals who have earned the respect of their companions. Such leaders cannot demand anyone's obedience. This insight is not breaking news. In his Lectures on Jurisprudence, which was published posthumously in 1896, Adam Smith wrote, "In a nation of hunters there is properly no government at all. They have agreed among themselves to keep together for their mutual safety, but they have no authority over one another." It's not surprising that conservative evolutionary psychologists have found foragers' insistence on sharing to be one of their most difficult nuts to crack. Given the iconic status of Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, and the popularized status quo protective notion of the all-against-all struggle for survival, the quest to explain why foraging people are so maddeningly generous to one another has occupied dozens of authors. In The Origins of Virtue, science writer Matt Ridley summarizes the inherent contradiction they face. Our minds have been built by selfish genes, but they have been built to be social, trustworthy, and cooperative. One must walk a tightrope to insist that selfishness is, and has always been, the principal engine of human evolution, even in the face of copious data demonstrating that human social organization was founded upon an impulse for sharing for many millennia. Of course, this conflict would evaporate if proponents of the always selfish theory of human nature accepted contextual limits to their argument. In other words, in a zero-sum context, like that of modern capitalist societies where we live among strangers, it makes sense on some levels for individuals to look out for themselves. But in other contexts, human behavior is characterized by an equal instinct toward generosity and justice. Even if many of his followers prefer to ignore the subtleties of his arguments, Dawkins himself appreciates them fully, writing, "Much of animal nature is indeed altruistic, cooperative, and even attended by benevolent subjective emotions. Altruism at the level of the individual organism can be a means by which the underlying genes maximize their self-interest." Despite famously inventing the concept of the selfish gene, Dawkins sees group cooperation as a way to advance an individual's agenda, thereby advancing each individual's genetic interests. Why, then, are so many of his admirers unwilling to entertain the notion that cooperation among human beings and other animals may be every bit as natural and effective as short-sighted selfishness? Non-human primates offer intriguing evidence of the soft power of peace, and not just horny bonobos either. Franz de Waal and Janice Johanowicz devised an experiment to see what would happen when two different macaque species were placed together for 5 months. Rhesus monkeys, Macaca mulatta, are aggressive and violent, while stumptails, Macaca arctoids, are known for their more chilled-out approach to life. The stumptails, for example, make up after conflict by gripping each other's hips, whereas reconciliations are rarely witnessed among rhesus monkeys. Once the two species were placed together, however, the scientists saw that the more peaceful, conciliatory behavior of the stumptails dominated the more aggressive rhesus attitudes. Gradually, the rhesus monkeys relaxed. As de Waal recounts, juveniles of the two species played together, groomed together, and slept in large mixed huddles. Most importantly, the rhesus monkeys developed peacemaking skills on a par with those of their more tolerant groupmates. Even when the experiment concluded and the two species were once again housed only with their own kind, the rhesus monkeys were still 3 times more likely to reconcile after conflict and groom their rivals. A fluke? Neuroscientist primatologist Robert Sapolsky has spent decades observing a group of baboons in Kenya, starting when he was a student in 1978. In the mid-1980s, a significant proportion of adult males in the group abruptly died of tuberculosis they'd picked up from infected food in a dump outside a tourist hotel. But the prized, albeit infected dump food had been eaten only by the most belligerent baboons, who had driven away less aggressive males, females, or juveniles. Justice! With all the hard-ass males gone, the laid-back survivors were in charge. The defenseless troop was a treasure ready-made for pirates. A whole troop of females, subadults, and easily cowed males just waiting for some neighboring tough guys to waltz in and start raping and pillaging. Because male baboons leave their natal troop at adolescence, within a decade of the dump cataclysm, none of the original atypically mellow males were still around. But, as Sapolsky reports, the troop's unique culture was being adopted by new males joining the troop. In 2004, Sapolsky reported that 2 decades after the tuberculosis tragedy, the troops still showed higher than normal rates of males grooming and affiliating with females, an unusually relaxed dominance hierarchy, and physiological evidence of lower than normal anxiety levels among the normally stressed out low-ranking males. Even more recently, Sapolsky told us that as of his most recent visit in the summer of 2007, the troops' unique culture appeared to be intact. In Hierarchy in the Forest, primatologist Christopher Boehm argues that egalitarianism is an eminently rational, even hierarchical political system, writing, "Individuals who otherwise would be subordinated are clever enough to form a large and united political coalition, and they do so for the express purpose of keeping the strong from dominating the weak." According to Boehm, foragers are downright feline in refusing to follow orders, writing, "Nomadic foragers are universally, and all but obsessively, concerned with being free of the authority of others." Prehistory must have been a frustrating time for megalomaniacs. An individual endowed with the passion for control, writes psychologist Erich Fromm, would have been a social failure and without influence. What if, thanks to the combined efforts of very low population density, a highly omnivorous digestive system, our uniquely elevated social intelligence, institutionalized sharing of food, casually promiscuous sexuality leading to generalized childcare, and group defense, human prehistory was in fact a time of relative peace and prosperity? If not a golden age, then at least a silver age, Bronze Age being taken. Without falling into dreamy visions of paradise, dare we consider the possibility that our ancestors lived in a world where, for most people, on most days, there was enough for everyone? By now, everyone knows there's no free lunch. But what would it mean if our species evolved in a world where every lunch was free? How would our appreciation of prehistory, and consequently of ourselves, change if we saw that our journey began in leisure and plenty, only veering into misery, scarcity, and ruthless competition 100 centuries ago? Difficult as it may be for some to accept, skeletal evidence clearly shows that our ancestors didn't experience widespread chronic scarcity until the advent of agriculture. Chronic food shortages and scarcity-based economies are artifacts of social systems that arose with farming. In his introduction to Limited Wants, Unlimited Means, Gowdy points to the central irony. Hunter-gatherers spent their abundant leisure time eating, drinking, playing, socializing, in short, doing the very things we associate with affluence. Despite no solid evidence to support it, the public hears little to dispute this apocalyptic vision of prehistory. The sense of human nature intrinsic to Western economic theory is mistaken. The notion that humans are driven only by self-interest is, in Gowdy's words, a microscopically small minority view among the tens of thousands of cultures that have existed since Homo sapiens emerged some 200,000 years ago. For the vast majority of human generations that have ever lived, it would be unthinkable to hoard food when those around you were hungry. The hunter-gatherer, writes Gowdy, represents uneconomic man. Remember, even those wretched inhabitants of Tierra del Fuego, condemned to the bottom of the scale of human beings, threw down their hoes and walked away from their gardens once the HMS Beagle sailed out of sight. They knew firsthand how civilized people lived, yet they had not the least wish to return to England. Why would they? They were happy and contented, with plenty fruits, plenty fish, and plenty birdies. Chapter 13. The never-ending battle over prehistoric war. Brutish?
Evolutionists say that back in the twilight of life, a beast, name and nature unknown, planted a murderous seed, and that the impulse thus originated in that seed throbs forever in the blood of the brute's descendants. William Jennings Bryan.
Just as neo-Hobbesian fundamentalists hold that poverty is intrinsic to the eternal human condition, they maintain that war is fundamental to our nature. Author Nicholas Wade, for example, claims that warfare between pre-state societies was incessant, merciless, and conducted with the general purpose, often achieved, of annihilating the opponent. According to this view, our propensity for organized conflict has roots reaching deep into our biological past, back to distant primate ancestors by way of our foraging forebears. It's always been about making war, supposedly, not love. But nobody's very clear what all this incessant war was over. Despite his certainty that foragers' lives were plagued by constant warfare, Wade acknowledges that ancestral people lived in small egalitarian societies without property or leaders or differences of rank. So we're to understand that egalitarian, non-hierarchical, nomadic groups without property were constantly at war? Hunter-gatherer societies, possessing so little, and thus with so little to lose, other than their lives, living on a wide-open planet, were nothing like the densely populated, settled societies struggling over dwindling or accumulated resources in more recent historical times. Why would they be? We've no space for a comprehensive response to this aspect of the standard Hobbesian narrative, but we've selected 3 well-known figures associated with it for a closer look at their arguments and data. Evolutionary psychologist Steven Pinker, the revered primatologist Jane Goodall, and the world's most famous living anthropologist, Napoleon Chagnon. Professor Pinker, red in tooth and claw. Imagine a high-profile expert stands before a distinguished audience and argues that Asians are warlike people. In support of his argument, he presents statistics from 7 countries: Argentina, Poland, Ireland, Nigeria, Canada, Italy, and Russia. Wait a minute, you might say. Those aren't even Asian countries, except possibly Russia. The expert would be laughed off the stage, as he should be. In 2007, world-famous Harvard professor and best-selling author Steven Pinker gave a presentation built upon similarly flawed logic at the TED conference, Technology Entertainment Design, in Long Beach, California. Pinker's presentation provides both a concise statement of the neo-Hobbesian view of the origins of war and an illuminating look at the dubious rhetorical tactics often used to promote this blood-stained vision of our prehistory. The 29-minute talk is available at the TED website. We encourage you to watch at least the first 5 minutes dealing with prehistory before reading the following discussion. Go ahead. We'll wait here. Though Pinker spends less than 10% of his time discussing hunter-gatherers, a social configuration, you'll recall, that represents well over 95% of our time on the planet, he manages to make a real mess of things. 3.5 minutes into his talk, Pinker presents a chart based on Lawrence Keeley's War Before Civilization, The Myth of the Peaceful Savage. The chart shows the percentage of male deaths due to warfare in a number of foraging or hunting and gathering societies. He explains that the chart shows that hunter-gatherer males were far more likely to die in war than are men living today. But hold on. The 7 cultures listed are the Jivaro, 2 branches of Yanomami, the Mayenga, Dugumdani, Merngen, Huli, and Gabusi. The Jivaro and both Yanomami groups are from the Amazon region, the Merngen are from northern coastal Australia, and the other 4 are all from the conflict-ridden, densely populated highlands of Papua New Guinea. Are these groups representative of our hunter-gatherer ancestors? Not even close. Only one of the 7 societies cited by Pinker, the Merngen, even approaches being an immediate return foraging society, the way Russia is sort of Asian if you ignore most of its population and history. The Mernghyn had been living with missionaries, guns, and aluminum powerboats for decades by the time the data Pinker cites were collected in 1975. Not exactly prehistoric conditions. None of the other societies cited by Pinker are immediate return hunter-gatherers like our ancestors were. They cultivate yams, bananas, or sugarcane in village gardens while raising domesticated pigs, llamas, or chickens. Even beyond the fact that these societies are not remotely representative of our nomadic, immediate return hunter-gatherer ancestors, there are still further problems with the data Pinker cites. Among the Yanomami, true levels of warfare are subject to passionate debate among anthropologists, as we'll discuss shortly. The Mernghyn are not typical even of Australian native cultures, representing a bloody exception to the typical Australian Aborigine pattern of little to no intergroup conflict. Nor does Pinker get the Gabusi right. Bruce Nauft, the anthropologist whose research Pinker cites on his chart, says the Gabusi's elevated death rates had nothing to do with warfare. In fact, Nauft reports that warfare is rare among the Gabusi, writing, "Disputes over territory or resources are extremely infrequent and tend to be easily resolved." Despite all this, Pinker stood before his audience and argued with a straight face that his chart depicted a fair estimate of typical hunter-gatherer mortality rates in prehistoric war. This is quite literally unbelievable. But Pinker is not alone in employing such sleight of hand to advance Hobbes's dark view of human prehistory. In fact, this selective presentation of dubious data is disturbingly common in the literature on human bloodlust. In their book Demonic Males, Richard Wrangham and Dale Peterson admit that war is unusual in nature, a startling exception to the normal rule for animals. But because intergroup violence has been documented in both humans and chimps, they argue, a propensity for war must be an ancient human quality going back to our last common ancestor. We are, they warn, the dazed survivors of a continuous 5 million year habit of lethal aggression. Ouch. But where are the bonobos? In a book of over 250 pages, the word bonobo appears on only 11 of them, and the species is dismissed as offering a less relevant sense of our last common ancestor than the common chimpanzee does, although many primatologists argue the opposite, but at least they mentioned the bonobo. In 2007, David Livingstone Smith, author of The Most Dangerous Animal, Human Nature and the Origins of War, published an essay exploring the evolutionary argument that war is rooted in our primate past. In his grisly accounts of chimps pummeling one another to a bloody pulp and eating each other alive, Smith repeatedly refers to them as our closest non-human relative. You'd never know from reading his essay that we have an equally close non-human relative. The bonobo was left strangely, if typically, unmentioned. Amid the macho posturing about the brutal implications of chimpanzee violence, doesn't the equally relevant, non-warring bonobo rate a mention at least? Why all the yelling about yang with nary a whisper of yin? All darkness and no light may get audiences excited, but it can't illuminate them. The "oops, forgot to mention the bonobo" technique is distressingly common in the literature on the ancient origins of war. But the bonobo's conspicuous absence is notable not just in discussions of war. Look for the missing bonobo wherever someone claims an ancient pedigree for human male violence of any sort. See if you can find the bonobo in this account of the origins of rape from the dark side of man. Men did not invent rape. Instead, they very likely inherited rape behavior from our ape ancestral lineage. Rape is a standard male reproductive strategy and likely has been one for millions of years. Male humans, chimpanzees, and orangutans routinely rape females. Wild gorillas violently abduct females to mate with them. Captive gorillas also rape females. Leaving aside the complications of defining rape in non-human species unable to communicate their experiences and motivations, rape, along with infanticide, war, and murder, has never been witnessed among bonobos in several decades of observation. Not in the wild, not in the zoo, never. Doesn't that warrant a footnote even? The mysterious disappearance of Margaret Power. Even apart from doubts raised by bonobos, there are serious questions worth asking about the nature of chimp warfare. In the 1970s, Richard Wrangham was a graduate student studying the relation between food supply and chimp behavior at Jane Goodall's Research Center in Gombe, Tanzania. In 1991, 5 years before Wrangham and Peterson's Demonic Males came out, Margaret Power published a carefully researched book, The Egalitarians, Human and Chimpanzee, that asked important questions concerning some of Goodall's research on chimpanzees, without, it must be said, ever expressing anything but admiration for Goodall's scientific integrity and intentions. But Power's name and her doubts are nowhere to be found in Demonic Males. Power noticed that data Goodall collected in her first years at Gombe, from 1961 to 1965, painted a different picture of chimpanzee social interaction than the accounts of chimpanzee warfare she and her colleagues published to global acclaim a few years later. Observations from those first 4 years at Gombe had left Goodall with the impression that chimps were far more peaceable than humans. She saw no evidence of war between groups and only sporadic outbreaks of violence between individuals. These initial impressions of overall primate peace mesh with research published 4 decades later, in 2002, by primatologists Robert Sussman and Paul Garber, who conducted a comprehensive review of the scientific literature on social behavior in primates. After reviewing more than 80 studies of how various primates spend their waking hours, they found that in almost all species across the board, from diurnal lemurs, the most primitive primates, to apes, usually less than 5% of their day is spent in any active social behavior whatsoever. Sussman and Garber found that usually less than 1% of their day is spent fighting or competing, and it's usually much less than 1%. They found cooperative, affiliative behavior like playing and grooming to be 10 to 20 times more common than conflict in all primate species. But Goodall's impression of relative harmony was to change, not coincidentally, argues Power, precisely when she and her students began giving the chimps hundreds of bananas every day to entice them to hang around the camp so they could be observed more easily. In the wild, chimps spread out to search for food individually or in small groups. Because the food is scattered throughout the jungle, competition is unusual. But, as Franz de Waal explains, as soon as humans start providing food, even in the jungle, the peace is quickly disturbed. The mounds of deliciously smelly fruit locked in reinforced concrete boxes, opened only for timed regular feedings, altered the chimp's behavior dramatically. Goodall's assistants had to keep rebuilding the boxes as the frustrated apes found endless ways of prying or smashing them open. Ripe fruit that could not be eaten immediately was a new experience for them, one that left the chimps confused and enraged. Imagine telling a room of unruly 3-year-olds on Christmas morning, each with the strength of 4 adult men, that they'll have to wait an unspecified amount of time to open the piles of presents they can see right there under the tree. Recalling this period a few years later, Goodall wrote, "The constant feeding was having a marked effect upon the behavior of the chimps. They were beginning to move about in large groups more often than they had ever done in the old days. They were sleeping near camp and arriving in noisy hordes early in the morning. Worst of all, the adult males were becoming increasingly aggressive. Not only was there a great deal more fighting than ever before, but many of the chimps were hanging around camp for hours and hours every day." Margaret Power's doubts concerning Goodall's provisioning of the chimps have been largely left unaddressed by most primatologists, not just Wrangham. Michael Giglieri, for example, went to study the chimps in Kibale Forest in nearby Uganda, specifically in response to the notion that the intergroup conflict Goodall's team had witnessed might have been due to the distorting effects of those banana boxes. Giglieri writes, "My mission was to find out whether these warlike killings were normal or an artifact of the researchers having provisioned the chimps with food to observe them. But somehow Margaret Power's name doesn't even appear in the index of Gigleri's book, published 8 years after hers. We lack the space to adequately explore the questions Power raised, or to address subsequent reports of intergroup conflict among some, but not all, unprovisioned chimps in other study areas. While we've got our doubts about the motivations of Pinker and Shagnon, like Margaret Power, we have none about Jane Goodall's intentions or scientific integrity. Still, with all due respect to Goodall, Power's questions deserve consideration by anyone seriously interested in the debate over the possible primate origins of warfare. The Spoils of War. Margaret Power's questions cut to the heart of the matter. Why fight if there's nothing worth fighting over? Before the scientists started provisioning the apes, food appeared throughout the jungle, so the chimps spread out in search of something to eat each day. Chimps often call out to the others when they find a fruiting tree. Mutual aid helps everyone, and feeding in the forest isn't a zero-sum endeavor. But once they learned that there would be a limited amount of easy food available in the same place each day, more and more chimps started arriving in aggressive, noisy hordes and hanging around. Soon after, Goodall and her students began witnessing the now famous warfare between chimp groups. Perhaps for the first time ever, the chimps had something worth fighting over: a concentrated, reliable, yet limited source of food. Suddenly, they lived in a zero-sum world. Applying this same reasoning to human societies, we're left wondering why immediate return hunter-gatherers would risk their lives to fight wars. Over what exactly? Food? That's spread out in the environment. Societies indigenous to areas where food is concentrated by natural conditions, like the periodic salmon runs of the Pacific Northwest of the United States and Canada, tend not to be immediate return hunter-gatherers. We're more likely to find complex, hierarchical societies like the Kwakiutl, discussed later, in such spots. Possessions? Foragers have few possessions of any non-sentimental value. Land? Our ancestors evolved on a planet nearly empty of human beings for the vast majority of our existence as a species. Women? Possibly, but this claim presumes that population growth was important to foragers, and that women were commodities to be fought over and traded like the livestock of pastoralists. It's likely that keeping populations stable was more important to foragers than expanding it. As we've seen, when a group reaches a certain number of people, it tends to split into smaller groups anyway, and there is no inherent advantage in having more people to feed in band-level societies. We've also seen that women and men would have been free to move among different bands in the fission-fusion social system typical of hunter-gatherers, chimps, and bonobos. The causal reverberations between social structure, foraging, horticultural, agrarian, industrial, population density, and the likelihood of war is supported by research conducted by sociologist Patrick Nolan, who found warfare is more likely in advanced horticultural and agrarian societies than it is in hunting and gathering and simple horticultural societies. When he limited his analysis only to hunter-gatherer and agrarian societies, Nolan found that above-average population density was the best predictor of war. This finding is problematic for the argument that human war is a 5-million-year habit, given our ancestors' low population densities until the post-agricultural population explosion began just a few thousand years ago. Recent research looking at changes in mitochondrial DNA confirms that already low prehistoric global human population levels dropped nearly to extinction at several points due to climatological catastrophes probably triggered by volcanic eruptions, asteroid strikes, and sudden changes in ocean currents. As mentioned previously, the entire world population of Homo sapiens may have dropped to just a few thousand individuals as recently as 74,000 years ago, when the massive Toba eruption severely disrupted world climate. But even with much of the northern hemisphere covered in ice, the world was anything but crowded for our distant ancestors. Population demographics have triggered wars in more recent historical times. Ecologist Peter Turchin and anthropologist Andrei Korotayev looked at data from English, Chinese, and Roman history, finding strong statistical correlations between increases in population density and warfare. Their research suggests population growth could account for as much as 90% of the variation between historical periods of war and peace. Early agriculture's stores of harvested grain and herds of placid livestock were like boxes of bananas in the jungle. There was now something worth fighting over. More. More land to cultivate, more women to increase population to work the land, raise armies to defend it and help with the harvest, more slaves for the hard labor of planting, harvesting, and fighting. Failed crops in one area would lead desperate farmers to raid neighbors who would retaliate, and so on, over and over. Freedom from war is just another word for nothing to lose or gain. But neo-Hobbesians ignore this rather straightforward analysis and the data supporting it, insisting that war must be an eternal human drive, all too often resorting to desperate rhetorical tactics like pinkers to defend their view. In the 4th chapter of his book, Six Societies, Challenging the Myth of Primitive Harmony, for example, Robert Edgerton writes, "Social stratification developed in some small-scale societies that lacked not only bureaucracies and priesthoods, but cultivation as well." Okay, but in support of this assertion about social stratification and brutal rule by elites in small-scale societies, he offers 15 pages of vivid descriptions of, in this order, and leaving nothing out, the Kwakiutl Indians of Vancouver Island, a slave-owning, settled, property-accumulating, potlatch-celebrating, complex hierarchical society, the Aztec Empire, numbering in the millions, with elaborate religious structures, priesthoods, and untold acres of slave-cultivated land, around a capital city larger than any in Europe at the time of first contact, featuring sewage systems and lighted streets at night, the Zulu Empire, again numbering well into the millions, with slavery, intensive agriculture, animal domestication, and continent-wide trade networks, the Asante Empire of present-day Ghana, which, Edgerton tells us, was incomparably the greatest military power in West Africa. What any of these empires have to do with small-scale societies with no bureaucracies, priesthoods, or cultivation, Edgerton doesn't say. In fact, he doesn't mention a single foraging society for the rest of the chapter. This is like declaring that cats are difficult to train, then offering as evidence German shepherds, beagles, greyhounds, and golden retrievers. In Beyond War, anthropologist Doug Fry rebuts the neo-Hobbesian view of universal war. The belief that there has always been war, Fry writes, does not correspond with the archaeological facts of the matter. Anthropologist Leslie Sponsel agrees, writing, "Lack of archaeological evidence for warfare suggests that it was rare or absent for most of human prehistory." After conducting a comprehensive review of prehistoric skeletal evidence, anthropologist Brian Ferguson concluded that, apart from one particular site in modern-day Sudan, only about a dozen Homo sapiens skeletons 10,000 years or older, out of hundreds of similar antiquity examined to date, show clear indications of interpersonal violence. Ferguson continues, "If warfare were prevalent in early prehistoric times, the abundant materials in the archaeological record would be rich with evidence of warfare. But the signs are not there." Our bullshit detectors go off when scholars point to violent chimps and a few cherry-picked horticultural human societies mislabeled as foragers, claiming these as evidence of ancient tendencies toward warfare. Even more troubling, these scholars often remain mute on the distorting effects on chimps of food provisioning, ever-shrinking habitats under siege from armies of hungry soldiers and poachers, reduced living space, food, and genetic vigor. Equally troubling is their silence on the crucial effects of population demographics, and the rise of the agricultural state on the likelihood of human conflict. The Napoleonic invasion, the Yanomami controversy. As the summer of love was winding down and Jane Goodall's first reports of chimpanzee warfare were exploding into public consciousness, Napoleon Chagnon suddenly became the world's most famous living anthropologist with the publication of Yanomamo, the Fierce People. The year 1968 was a good one to come out with a dashing anthropological adventure yarn claiming to prove that warfare is ancient and integral to human nature. The year began with the Velvet Revolution in Prague and the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. Martin Luther King Jr.'s worst dream came true in Memphis, Robert Kennedy was felled on a Los Angeles stage, and blood and chaos ran in the streets of Chicago. Richard Nixon slinked into the White House, Charles Manson and his followers plotted mayhem in the dry hills above Malibu, and the Beatles put the final touches on the White Album. The year ended with 3 American astronauts, for the first time ever, gazing back upon this fragile blue planet floating in eternal silence, praying for peace. Given all that, perhaps it's not surprising that Chagnon's account of the chronic warfare of the innately violent Yanomami struck a public nerve. Desperate to understand human murderousness, the public lapped up his depictions of the day-to-day brutality of people he described as our contemporary ancestors. Now in its 5th edition, Yanomamo, the Fierce People, is still the all-time bestseller in anthropology, with millions of copies sold to university students alone. Chagnon's books and films have figured prominently in the education of several generations of anthropologists, most of whom accepted his claims to have demonstrated the inherent ferocity of our species. But Chagnon's research should be approached with caution, as he employs a host of dubious techniques. Ferguson found, for example, that Chagnon conflates common murder with war in his statistics, as does Pinker in his discussion of the Gabusi. But more importantly, Chagnon fails to account for the effects of his own disruptive, rather Hemingway-esque presence among the people he studied. According to Patrick Tierney, author of Darkness in El Dorado, the wars that made Chagnon and the Yanomami famous, the ones he wrote about with such relish in The Fierce People, began on November 14, 1964, the same day the anthropologist arrived with his shotguns, outboard motor, and a canoe full of steel goods to give away. Tierney cites Chagnon's own doctoral thesis, showing that in the 13 years prior to his arrival, no Namawei, a large branch of the Yanomami, had been killed in warfare. But during his 13-month residence among them, 10 Yanomami died in a conflict between the Namawei and the Patanawateri, another branch. Kenneth Good, an anthropologist who first went to live with the Yanomami as one of Chagnon's graduate students and stayed on for 12 years, described Chagnon as a hit-and-run anthropologist who comes into villages with armloads of machetes to purchase cooperation for his research. Unfortunately, wrote Good, he creates conflict and division wherever he goes. Part of Chagnon's disruptiveness, no doubt, resulted from his blustery, macho self-conception, but his research goals may have been an even bigger source of problems. He wanted to collect genealogical information from the Yanomami. This is a tricky proposition, to say the least, given that the Yanomami consider it disrespectful to speak names out loud. Naming the dead requires breaking one of the strongest taboos in their culture. Juan Finkers, who lived among them for 25 years, says, "To name the dead among the Yanomami is a grave insult, a motive of division, fights, and wars." Anthropologist Marshall Solins described Chagnon's research as an absurdist anthropological project, trying to work out ancestor-based lineages among a people who, by taboo, could not know, could not trace, and could not name their ancestors, or for that matter, could not bear to hear their own names. Chagnon dealt with his host's taboo by playing one village off against another. In his own account, he began taking advantage of local arguments and animosities in selecting my informants traveling to other villages to check the genealogies, picking villages that were on strained terms with the people about whom I wanted information. I would then return to my base camp and check with local informants the accuracy of the new information. If the informants became angry when I mentioned the names I acquired from the unfriendly group, I was almost certain that the information was accurate. I occasionally hit a name that put the informant into a rage, such as that of a dead brother or sister that other informants had not reported. To recap, 1. Our hero swashbuckles into Yanomami lands, bringing machetes, axes, and shotguns he presents to a few select groups, thereby creating disruptive power imbalances between groups. 2. He detects and aggravates pre-existing tensions between communities by goading them to disrespect each other's honored ancestors and dead loved ones. 3. Inflaming the situation further, Shagnon reports the offenses he's provoked, using the resulting rage to confirm the validity of his genealogical data. 4. Having thus inflicted and salted the Yanomami's wounds, Shagnon sallies forth to seduce the American public with tales of daring do among the vicious and violent savages. The word anthro has entered the vocabulary of the Yanomami. It signifies a powerful non-human with deeply disturbed tendencies and wild eccentricities. Since 1995, Shagnon has been legally barred from returning to the lands of the Yanomami. When anthropologist Leslie Sponsel lived among the Yanomami in the mid-1970s, he saw no warfare, just one physical fight, and heard a few loud marital disputes. To my surprise, writes Sponsel, people in my village and 3 neighboring villages were simply nothing like the fierce people described by Shagnon. Sponsel had brought along a copy of Shagnon's book, with its photos of fighting Yanomami warriors, as a way to explain the sort of work he was doing. Although some of the men were absorbed by the pictures, he writes, I was asked not to show them to children, as they provided examples of undesirable behavior. These Yanomami, Sponsel concluded, did not value fierceness in any positive way. For his part, in over a decade living among them, Good witnessed a single outbreak of war. He cut his association with Shagnon eventually, having concluded the emphasis on Yanomami violence was contrived and distorted. Good later wrote that Shagnon's book had blown the subject out of any sane proportion, arguing that what he had done was tantamount to saying that New Yorkers are muggers and murderers. The desperate search for hippie hypocrisy and bonobo brutality. For a certain kind of journalist or evolutionary psychologist, nothing is more satisfying than exposing hippie hypocrisy. A recent headline from Reuters reads, Hippie apes make war as well as love, study finds. The article states, despite their reputation as lovers, not fighters, of the primate world, bonobos actually hunt and kill monkeys. Another assures us that, despite peacenik reputation, bonobos hunt and eat other primates too. A third, under the heading, Sex-Crazed Apes Feast on Killing Too, opens with an audible sneer. As hippies had Altamont, where Hell's Angels killed a concert-goer, so bonobos have Salonga National Park, where scientists have witnessed the supposedly peace-loving primate hunting and eating monkey children. Sex-crazed? Supposedly peace-loving? Eating monkey children? Do monkeys have children? If both chimps and bonobos make war, maybe we are dazed survivors of a 5-million-year habit of lethal aggression after all. But a closer look reveals that it's the journalists who are a bit dazed. Researchers witnessed 10 attempts to hunt monkeys over 5 years of observing the bonobos in question. The bonobos were successful 3 times, sharing the monkey meat among the hunters, mixed groups of males and females. A brief reality check for science journalists. Researchers have long known and reported that bonobos regularly hunt and eat meat, generally small jungle antelopes, known as duikers, as well as squirrels, insects, and grubs. The evolutionary line leading to humans, chimps, and bonobos split from that leading to monkeys about 30 million years ago. Chimps and bonobos, in other words, are as closely related to monkeys as we are. Young monkeys are not children. Monkey meat is on the menu at fancy Chinese restaurants and jungle barbecues in many parts of the world. Tens of thousands of monkeys, young and old, are sacrificed in research laboratories throughout the world annually. So, are humans also at war with monkeys? Nothing sells newspapers like headlines of war, and no doubt cannibalistic hippie orgy war sells even more, but one species hunting and eating another species is hardly war, it's lunch. That bonobos and monkeys may look similar to untrained eyes is irrelevant. When a pack of wolves or coyotes attacks a stray dog, is that war? We've seen hawks pluck pigeons out of the sky. War? Asking whether our species is naturally peaceful or warlike, generous or possessive, free-loving or jealous, is like asking whether H2O is naturally a solid, liquid, or gas. The only meaningful answer to such a question is, it depends. On a nearly empty planet, with food and shelter distributed widely, avoiding conflict would have been an easy, attractive option. Under the conditions typical of ancestral environments, human beings would have had much more to lose than to gain from warring against one another. The evidence, both physical and circumstantial, points to a human prehistory in which our ancestors made far more love than war. Chapter 14. The Longevity Lie. Short?
The days of our years are 80 years and 10. And if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow. For it is soon cut off, and we fly away. Psalms 90, verse 10.
Strange but true, the average height expectancy of prehistoric humans was about 3 feet, so a 4-foot-tall man was considered a giant. Does that fact alter your image of prehistory? Are you picturing a diminutive race of bonsai people living in mini caves, chasing rabbits into holes, cowering in fear of foxes, being carried off by hawks? Does this cause you to rethink what a challenge a mammoth hunt must have been for our half-pint ancestors? Does it make you feel even luckier to be living today, when our superior diet and sanitation have doubled the average person's height expectancy? Well, don't get carried away. While it is technically true that the average height expectancy of prehistoric men was about 3 feet, it's a misleading sort of truth. Like overconfident declarations about the universality of marriage, poverty, and war, it's the sort of assertion that sows confusion and results in a harvest of misleading data. Take the average height of a full-grown man living in prehistoric times, using skeletal remains as a guide, about 6 feet tall, 72 inches. Then take the average size of a prehistoric infant skeleton, let's say about 20 inches. Then extrapolate from the ratio of infant to adult skeletons at known archaeological burial sites and presume that in general, for every 3 people who lived to adulthood, 7 died as infants. Thus, owing to the high rate of infant mortality, average human height in prehistory was 3 times 72 plus 7 times 20 divided by 10 equals 35.6 inches, roughly 3 feet. Absurd? Yes. Misleading? Yep. Statistically accurate? Well, kinda. This height expectancy truth is no more absurd or misleading than what most people are led to believe about human life expectancy in prehistory. Exhibit A. In an interview with NBC Nightly News, UCSF biophysicist Jeff Lotz was discussing the prevalence of chronic back pain in the United States. The millions of people watching that night heard him explain, "It wasn't until 200 or 300 years ago that we lived past age 45, so our spines really haven't evolved to the point where they can maintain this upright posture with these large gravity loads for the duration of our lives. Exhibit B. In an otherwise solid book about women in prehistory, The Invisible Sex, an archaeologist, an anthropologist, and an editor of one of the world's leading science magazines team up to imagine the life of a typical woman they call Ursula, living in Europe 45,000 years ago. Life was hard, they write, and many, especially the young and the old, died of starvation in winter and accidents of one sort or another, as well as disease. Ursula, having had her first daughter at age 15, lived long enough to see her first granddaughter, dying at the ripe old age of 37. Exhibit C. In a New York Times article, James Vaupel, director of the Laboratory of Survival and Longevity at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, explains there is no fixed lifespan. Dr. Vaupel points to the increase in life expectancy from 1840 to today in countries where the figure is rising quickest, and notes that this increase is linear, absolutely linear, with no evidence of any decline or tapering off. From this he concludes, there's no reason that life expectancy can't continue to go up 2 to 3 years per decade. Except that there is. At some point, all the babies who can survive to adulthood do. Further advances will be slight. When does life begin? When does it end? The preceding numbers are just as fantastical as the ones we came up with for our average height expectancy estimate. They are, in fact, based upon the same erroneous calculation distorted by high infant mortality rates. When this factor is eliminated, we see that prehistoric humans who survived beyond childhood typically lived from 66 to 91 years, with higher levels of overall health and mobility than we find in most Western societies today. It's a game of averages, you see. While it's true that many infants and small children died in prehistoric populations, as indicated by the larger numbers of infant skeletons in most burial sites, these skeletons tell us nothing about what constituted a ripe old age. Life expectancy at birth, which is the measure generally cited, is far from an accurate measure of the typical lifespan. When you read, at the beginning of the 20th century, life expectancy at birth was around 45 years. It has risen to about 75 thanks to the advent of antibiotics and public health measures that allow people to survive or avoid infectious diseases. Keep in mind that this dramatic increase is much more a reflection of increased infant survival than of adults living longer. In Mozambique, where one of us was born and raised, the average life expectancy at birth for a man is currently, tragically, about 42 years. But Casilda's father was 93 when he died, riding his bicycle right to the end of the road. He was old. A 40-year-old is not even in Mozambique. No doubt many prehistoric infants died from disease or harsh conditions, as do the infants of other primates, human foragers, and modern Mozambikians. But many anthropologists agree it's likely that a large portion of infant mortality, once attributed to starvation and disease, probably resulted from infanticide. They argue that foraging societies limited the number of infants so they wouldn't become a burden to the group or allow overly rapid population growth to strain food supplies. Horrific as it may be for us to contemplate, infanticide is anything but a rarity even today. Anthropologist Nancy Shepper Hughes studied contemporary infant deaths in northeast Brazil, where about 20% of infants die in their first year. She found that women consider the deaths of some children a blessing if the babies were lethargic and passive. Mothers told Shepper Hughes they were children who wanted to die, whose will to live was not sufficiently strong or developed. Shepper Hughes found that these children received less food and medical attention than their more vigorous siblings. Joseph Birdsell, one of the world's greatest scholars of Australian Aboriginal culture, estimated that as many as half of all infants were intentionally destroyed. Various surveys of contemporary pre-industrial societies conclude that anywhere from half to 3/4 of them practice some form of direct infanticide. Lest we start feeling too smug in our compassion and superiority, recall the foundling hospitals of Europe. The number of babies delivered to near certain death in France rose from 40,000 in 1784 to almost 140,000 by 1822. By 1830, there were 270 revolving boxes in French foundling hospital doors, specially designed to protect the anonymity of those depositing unwanted infants. 80 to 90% of these children are estimated to have died within a year of arrival. Once our ancestors began cultivating land for food, they were running on a wheel, but never fast enough. More land provides more food, and more food means more children born and fed. More children provide more help on the farm and more soldiers. But this population growth creates demand for more land, which can be won and held only through conquest and war. Put another way, the shift to agriculture was accelerated by the seemingly irrefutable belief that it's better to take strangers' land, killing them if necessary, than to allow one's own children to die of starvation. Closer to our own time, the BBC reports that as many as 15% of the reported deaths of female infants in parts of southern India are victims of infanticide. Millions more die in China, where female infanticide is prevalent and has been for centuries. A late 19th century missionary living in China reported that of 183 sons and 175 daughters born in a typical community, 126 of the sons lived to age 10, 69%, while only 53 of the daughters made it that far, 30%. China's one-child policy, combined with the cultural preference for sons, has only worsened the already dismal odds of survival for female infants. There are also problematic cultural assumptions lurking within demographers' calculations, in which life is assumed to begin at birth. This view is far from universal. Societies that practice infanticide don't consider newborn infants full human beings. Rituals ranging from baptism to naming ceremonies are delayed until it is determined whether or not the child will be permitted to live. If not, from this perspective, the child was never fully alive anyway.
Is 80 the new 30? Cartoon in the New Yorker. Two cavemen are shown chatting, one of whom is saying, "Something's just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure. We all get plenty of exercise. Everything we eat is organic and free range. And yet nobody lives past 30.
Statistical distortions due to infanticide are not the only source of confusion concerning prehistoric longevity. As you might imagine, it's not so easy to determine the age at death of a skeleton that's been in the ground for thousands of years. For various technical reasons, archaeologists often underestimate the age at death. For example, archaeologists estimated the ages at death of skeletons taken from mission cemeteries in California. After the estimates had been made, written records of the actual ages at death were discovered. While the archaeologists had estimated that only about 5% had lived to age 45 or beyond, the documents proved that 7 times that many, 37%, of the people buried in these cemeteries were over 45 years of age when they died. If estimates can be so far off on skeletons just a few hundred years old, imagine the inaccuracies with remains that are tens of thousands of years old. One of the most reliable techniques archaeologists use to estimate age at death is dental eruption. They look at how far the molars have grown out of the jawbone, which indicates roughly how old a young adult was at death. But our wisdom teeth stop erupting in our early to mid-30s, which means that archaeologists note the age at death of skeletons beyond this point as 35 plus. This doesn't mean that 35 was the age of death, but that the person was 35 or older. He or she may have been anywhere from 35 to 100 years old. Nobody knows. Somewhere along the line, this notation system was mistranslated in the popular press, leaving the impression that our ancient ancestors rarely made it past 35. Big mistake. A wide range of data sources, including even the Old Testament, point to a typical human lifespan of anywhere from 70, 70, to over 90 years. In one study, scientists calibrated brain and body weight ratios across different primates, arriving at an estimate of 66 to 78 years for Homo sapiens. These numbers bear up under observation of modern-day foragers. Among the Kungsan, Hadza, and Aceh, societies in Africa and South America, a female who lived to 45 could be expected to survive another 20, 21.3, and 22.1 years, respectively. Among the Kungsan, most people who reach 60 could reasonably expect to live another 10 years or so, active years of mobility and social contribution. Anthropologist Richard Lee reported that 1 in 10 of the Kunghin counted in his time in Botswana were over 60 years of age. As mentioned in previous chapters, it's clear that overall human health, including longevity, took a severe hit from agriculture. The typical human diet went from extreme variety and nutritional richness to just a few types of grain, possibly supplemented by occasional meat and dairy. The Aceh diet, for example, includes 78 different species of mammal, 21 species of reptiles and amphibians, more than 150 species of birds, and 14 species of fish, as well as a wide range of plants. In addition to the reduced nutritional value of the agricultural diet, the diseases deadliest to our species began their dreadful rampage when human populations turned to agriculture. Conditions were perfect. High-density population centers stewing in their own filth, domesticated animals in close proximity, adding their excrement, viruses, and parasites to the mix, and extended trade routes facilitating the movement of contagious pathogens from populations with immunity to vulnerable communities. When James Larrick and his colleagues studied the still relatively isolated Waorani Indians of Ecuador, they found no evidence of hypertension, heart disease, or cancer, no anemia or common cold, no internal parasites, no sign of previous exposure to polio, pneumonia, smallpox, chickenpox, typhus, typhoid, syphilis, tuberculosis, malaria, or serum hepatitis. This is not as surprising as it may seem, given that almost all these diseases either originated in domesticated animals or depend upon high-density population for easy transmission. The deadliest infections, diseases, and parasites that have plagued our species could not have spread until after the transition to agriculture. Table 3. Deadly diseases from domesticated animals. Human disease, measles. Animal source, cattle, rinderpest. Tuberculosis, cattle. Smallpox, cattle, cowpox. Influenza, pigs and birds. Pertussis, pigs and dogs. Falciparum malaria, birds. The dramatic increases in world population that paralleled agricultural development don't indicate increased health, but increased fertility. More people living to reproduce, but lower quality of life for those who do. Even Edgerton, who repeatedly tells the longevity lie, foragers' lives are short, life expectancy at birth ranges between 20 and 40 years, has to agree that, somehow, foragers manage to be healthier than agriculturalists. Agriculturalists throughout the world were always less healthy than hunters and gatherers. The urban populations of Europe, he writes, did not match the longevity of hunter-gatherers until the mid-19th or even 20th century. That's in Europe. People living in Africa, most of Asia, and Latin America have still not regained the longevity typical of their ancestors, and, thanks to chronic world poverty, global warming, and AIDS, it's unlikely they will for the foreseeable future. Once pathogens mutate into human populations from domesticated animals, they quickly migrate from one community to another. For these agents of disease, the initiation of global trade was a boon. Bubonic plague took the Silk Route to Europe. Smallpox and measles stowed away on ships headed for the New World, while syphilis appears to have hitched a ride back across the Atlantic, probably on Columbus's first return voyage. Today, the Western world flutters into annual panics over avian flu scares emanating from the Far East. Ebola, SARS, flesh-eating bacteria, the H1N1 virus, swine flu, and innumerable pathogens yet to be named keep us all compulsively washing our hands. While there were no doubt occasional outbreaks of infectious diseases in prehistory, it's unlikely they spread far, even with high levels of sexual promiscuity. It would have been nearly impossible for pathogens to take hold in widely dispersed groups of foragers with infrequent contact between groups. The conditions necessary for devastating epidemics or pandemics just didn't exist until the agricultural revolution. The claim that modern medicine and sanitation save us from infectious diseases that ravaged pre-agricultural people, something we hear often, is like arguing that seatbelts and airbags protect us from car crashes that were fatal to our prehistoric ancestors. Stressed to death. If an infectious virus doesn't get you, a stressed-out lifestyle and high-fat diet probably will. Cortisol, the hormone your body releases when under stress, is the strongest immunosuppressant known. In other words, nothing weakens our defenses against disease quite like stress. Even something as seemingly unimportant as not getting enough sleep can have a dramatic effect on immunity. Sheldon Cohen and his colleagues studied the sleep habits of 153 healthy men and women for 2 weeks before putting them in quarantine and exposing them to rhinovirus, which causes the common cold. The less an individual slept, the more likely he or she was to come down with a cold. Those who slept less than 7 hours per night were 3 times as likely to get sick. If you want to live long, sleep more and eat less. To date, the only demonstrably effective method for prolonging mammalian life is severe caloric reduction. When pathologist Roy Walford fed mice about half of what they wanted to eat, they lived about twice as long, the equivalent of 160 human years. They not only lived longer, but stayed fitter and smarter as well, as judged by, you guessed it, running through mazes. Follow-up studies on insects, dogs, monkeys, and humans have confirmed the benefits of going through life hungry. Intermittent fasting was associated with more than a 40% reduction in heart disease risk in a study of 448 people published in the American Journal of Cardiology, reporting that most diseases, including cancer, diabetes, and even neurodegenerative illnesses, are forestalled by caloric reduction. These studies lead to the slacker-friendly conclusion that in the ancestral environment, where our predecessors lived hand-to-mouth, a certain amount of dietary inconsistency, perhaps exacerbated by sheer laziness, interrupted by regular aerobic exercise, would have been adaptive, even healthy. To put it another way, if you hunt or gather just enough low-fat food to forestall serious hunger pangs, and spend the rest of your time in low-stress activities, such as telling stories by the fire, taking extended hammock-embraced naps, and playing with children, you'd be engaged in the optimal lifestyle for human longevity. Which brings us back to the eternal question asked by foragers offered the chance to join the civilized world and adopt farming. Why? Why work so hard when there are so many mongongo nuts in the world? Why stress over weeding the garden when there are plenty fish, plenty fruits, and plenty birdies?
We are here on Earth to fart around, and don't let anybody tell you any different. Kurt Vonnegut, Jr.
In 1902, the New York Times carried a report headlined, "Laziness Germ Discovered." It seems one Dr. Stiles, a zoologist at the Department of Agriculture, had discovered the germ responsible for degenerates known as crackers or poor whites in the southern states. But in fact, our laziness seems less in need of explanation than our frenzied industry. How many beavers die in dam construction accidents? Are birds subject to sudden spells of vertigo that send them falling from the sky? How many fish drown to death? Such events are all rather infrequent, we'd wager, but the toll exacted upon humans by the chronic stress many consider a normal part of human life is massive. In Japan, there's a word for it. Karoshi, death from overwork. Japanese police records indicate that as many as 2,200 Japanese workers committed suicide in 2008 due to overwhelming work conditions, and 5 times that number died from stress-induced strokes and heart attacks, according to Rengo, a labor union federation. But whether our language contains a handy term for it or not, the devastating effects of chronic stress are not limited to Japan. Heart disease, circulatory problems, digestive disorders, insomnia, depression, sexual dysfunction, and obesity, behind every one of them lurks chronic stress. If we really did evolve in a Hobbesian ordeal of constant terror and anxiety, if our ancestors' lives truly were solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, why then are we still so vulnerable to stress? Who you callin' a starry-eyed romantic, pal? Many otherwise reasonable people seem to have a burning need to locate the roots of war deep in our primal past, to see self-sufficient foragers as poor, and to spread the misbegotten gospel that 3 or 4 decades was a ripe old age for a human being in pre-agricultural times. But this vision of our past is demonstrably false. ¿Qué pasa? If prehistoric life was a perpetual struggle that ended in early death, if ours is a species motivated almost exclusively by self-interest, if war is an ancient biologically embedded tendency, then one can soothingly argue, as Steven Pinker does, that things are getting better all the time. That in his Panglossian view, we are probably living in the most peaceful moment of our species' time on Earth. That would be encouraging news indeed, which is what most audiences want to hear, after all. We all want to believe things are getting better, that our species is learning, growing, and prospering. Who refuses congratulations for having the good sense to be alive here and now? But just as patriotism is the conviction that your country is superior to all others because you were born in it, G.B. Shaw, the notion that we live in our species' most peaceful moment is as intellectually baseless as it is emotionally comforting. Journalist Louis Menand noted how science can fulfill a conservative, essentially political function by providing an explanation for the way things are that does not threaten the way things are. Why, he asks rhetorically, should someone feel unhappy or engage in antisocial behavior when that person is living in the freest and most prosperous nation on earth? It can't be the system. What's your problem? Everything's just fine. Life's great and getting better. Less war, longer life, new and improved human existence. This Madison Avenue vision of the super-duper new and improved present is framed by an utterly fictional, blood-smeared Hobbesian past. Yet it's marketed to the public as the clear-eyed realist position, and those who question its founding assumptions risk being dismissed as delusional romantics still grieving over the death of Janis Joplin and the demise of bell-bottoms. But that realistic argument is riddled with misunderstood data, mistaken interpretations, and misleading calculations. A dispassionate review of the relevant science clearly demonstrates that the tens of thousands of years before the advent of agriculture, while certainly not a time of uninterrupted utopian bliss, was, for the most part, characterized by robust health, peace between individuals and groups, low levels of chronic stress, and high levels of overall satisfaction for most of our ancestors. Having made this argument, have we outed ourselves as card-carrying comrades in the delusional utopian movement? Dumb? Is it Rousseauian fantasy to assert that prehistory was not an unending nightmare? that human nature leans no more toward violence, selfishness, and exploitation than toward peace, generosity, and cooperation? That most of our ancient ancestors probably experienced a sense of communal belonging few of us can imagine today? That human sexuality probably evolved and functioned as a social bonding device and a pleasurable way to avoid and neutralize conflict? Is it silly romanticism to point out that ancient humans who survived their first few years often lived as long as the richest and luckiest of us do today, even with our high-tech coronary stents, diabetes medication, and titanium hips? No. If you think about it, the neo-Hobbesian vision is far sunnier than ours. To have concluded, as we have, that our species has an innate capacity for love and generosity at least equal to our taste for destruction, for peaceful cooperation as much as coordinated attack, for an open, relaxed sexuality as much as for jealous, passion-smothering possessiveness, to see that both these worlds were open to us, but that around 10,000 years ago, a few of our ancestors wandered off the path they'd been on forever into a garden of toil, disease, and conflict where our species has been trapped ever since. Well, this is not exactly a rose-colored view of the overall trajectory of humankind. Who are the naive romantics here anyway? Part 4. Bodies in Motion.
Love's mysteries and souls do grow, but yet the body is his book. John Donne, 1572 to 1631.
Everybody has a story to tell. So does every body, and the story told by the human body is rated XXX. Like any narrative of prehistory, ours rests on two types of evidence, circumstantial and material. We've already covered a good bit of the circumstantial evidence. As for more tangible material evidence, the song says, "What goes up must come down." But unfortunately for archaeologists and those of us who rely on their findings, what goes down rarely comes back up. And even when it does, ancient social behavior is hard to see reflected in bits of bone, flint, and pottery, fragments that represent only a fraction of what once existed. At a conference not long ago, the subject of our research came up over breakfast. Upon hearing that we were investigating human sexual behavior in prehistory, the professor sitting across the table from us scoffed and asked, rhetorically, "So what do? Close your eyes and dream?" While one should never scoff with a mouthful of scone, he had a point. As social behavior presumably doesn't leave physical artifacts, any theorizing must amount to little but dreaming. Paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould was an early scoffer at the notion of evolutionary psychology, asking, "How can we possibly know in detail what small bands of hunter-gatherers did in Africa 2 million years ago?" Richard Potts, director of the Smithsonian's Human Origins Program, agrees, warning, "Many characteristics of early human behavior are difficult to reconstruct, as no appropriate material evidence is available. Mating patterns and language are obvious examples. They leave no traces in the fossil record." But he then adds, as if under his breath, "Questions of social life may be accessible from studies of ancient environments or from certain aspects of anatomy and behavior that leave material evidence." Certain aspects of anatomy and behavior that leave material evidence. Can we glean reliable information about the contours of ancient social life, even sexual behavior, from present-day human anatomy? Yes, we can. Chapter 15. Little Big Man. Every creature's body tells a detailed story about the environment in which its ancestors evolved. Its fur, fat, and feathers suggest the temperatures of ancient environments. Its teeth and digestive system contain information about primordial diet. Its eyes, legs, and feet show how its ancestors got around. The relative sizes of males and females and the particulars of their genitalia say a lot about reproduction. In fact, male sexual ornaments, such as peacock's tails or lion's manes, and genitals offer the best way to differentiate between closely related species. Evolutionary psychologist Jeffrey F. Miller goes so far as to say that evolutionary innovation seems focused on the details of penis shape. Leaving aside for the moment the disturbingly Freudian notion that even Mother Nature is obsessed with the penis, our bodies certainly contain a wealth of information about the sexual behavior of our species over the millennia. There are clues encoded in skeletal remains millions of years old and pulsing in our own living bodies. It's all right there, and here. Rather than closing our eyes and dreaming, let's open them and learn to read the hieroglyphics of the sexual body. We begin with body-size dimorphism. This technical-sounding term simply refers to the average difference in size between adult males and females in a given species. Among apes, for example, male gorillas and orangutans average about twice the size of females, while male chimps, bonobos, and humans are from 10 to 20% bigger and heavier than females. Male and female gibbons are of equal stature. Among mammals generally, and particularly among primates, body-size dimorphism is correlated with male competition over mating. In winner-take-all mating systems, where males compete with each other over infrequent mating opportunities, the larger, stronger males tend to win and take all. The biggest, baddest gorillas, for example, will pass genes for bigness and badness into the next generation, thus leading to even bigger, badder male gorillas, until the increased size eventually runs into another factor limiting this growth. On the other hand, in species with little struggle over females, there is less biological imperative for the males to evolve larger, stronger bodies, so they generally don't. That's why the sexually monogamous gibbons are virtually identical in size. Looking at our modest body-size dimorphism, it's a good bet that males haven't been fighting much over females in the past few million years. As mentioned earlier, men's bodies are from 10 to 20% bigger and heavier than women's on average, a ratio that appears to have held steady for at least several million years. Owen Lovejoy has long argued that this ratio is evidence of the ancient origins of monogamy. In an article he published in Science in 1981, Lovejoy argued that both the accelerated brain development of our ancestors and their use of tools resulted from an already established hominid character system that featured intensified parenting and social relationships, monogamous pair bonding, specialized sexual reproductive behavior, and bipedality. Thus, Lovejoy argued, the nuclear family and human sexual behavior may have their ultimate origin long before the dawn of the Pleistocene. In fact, he concluded with a flourish, the unique sexual and reproductive behavior of man may be the sine qua non of human origin. Almost 3 decades later, Lovejoy is still pushing the same argument as this book goes to press. He argues, again in Science, that Ardipithecus ramidus's fragmentary skeletal and dental remains dated to 4.4 million years ago reinforced this view of pair bonding as the defining human characteristic, predating even our uniquely large neocortex. Like many theorists, Matt Ridley agrees with this ancient origin of monogamy, writing, long pair bonds shackled each ape man to its mate for much of its reproductive life. 4 million years is an awful lot of monogamy. Shouldn't these shackles be more comfortable by now? Without access to the skeletal data on body-size dimorphism we have today, Darwin speculated that early humans may have lived in a harem-based system. But we know now that if Darwin's conjecture were correct, contemporary men would be twice the size of women on average. And, as we'll discuss in the next section, another sure sign of a gorilla-like human past would be an embarrassing case of genital shrinkage. Still, some continue to insist that humans are naturally polygynous harem builders, despite the paucity of evidence supporting this argument. For example, Alan S. Miller and Satoshi Kanazawa claim that we know that humans have been polygynous throughout most of history because men are taller than women. These authors go on to conclude that because human males are 10% taller and 20% heavier than females, this suggests that throughout history, humans have been mildly polygynous. Their analysis ignores the fact that the cultural conditions necessary for some males to accumulate sufficient political power and wealth to support multiple wives and their children simply did not exist before agriculture. And males being moderately taller and heavier than females indicates reduced competition among males, but not necessarily mild polygyny. After all, those promiscuous cousins of ours, chimps and bonobos, reflect precisely the same range of male-female size difference while shamelessly enjoying uncounted sexual encounters with as many partners as they can drum up. No one claims the 10 to 20% body size dimorphism seen in chimps and bonobos is evidence of mild polygyny. The assertion that the same physical evidence correlates to promiscuity in chimps and bonobos, but indicates mild polygyny or monogamy in humans, shows just how shaky the standard model really is. For various reasons, prehistoric harems were unlikely for our species. The famed sexual appetites of Ishmael the Bloodthirsty, Genghis Khan, Brigham Young, and Wilt Chamberlain notwithstanding, our bodies argue strongly against it. Harems result from the common male hunger for sexual variety and the post-agricultural concentration of power in the hands of a few men combined with low levels of female autonomy typical of agricultural societies. Harems are a feature of militaristic, rigidly hierarchical agricultural and pastoral cultures oriented toward rapid population growth, territorial expansion, and accumulation of wealth. Captive harems have never been reported in any immediate return foraging society. While our species' shift to moderate body-size dimorphism strongly suggests that males found an alternative to fighting over mating opportunities millions of years ago, it doesn't tell us what that alternative was. Many theorists have interpreted the shift as confirmation of a transition from polygyny to monogamy, but that conclusion requires us to ignore multi-male, multi-female mating as an option for our ancestors. Yes, a one-man, one-woman system reduces competition among males, as the pool of available females isn't being dominated by just a few men, leaving more women available for less desired men. But a mating system in which both males and females typically have multiple sexual relationships running in parallel reduces male mating competition just as effectively, if not more so. And given that both of the species closest to us practice multi-male, multi-female mating, this seems by far the more likely scenario. Why are scientists so reluctant to consider the implications of our two closest primate relatives displaying the same levels of body size dimorphism we do? Could it be because neither is remotely monogamous? The only two acceptable interpretations of this shift in body size dimorphism appear to be, 1. It indicates the origins of our nuclear family sexually monogamous mating system. Then why aren't men and women the same size, like gibbons? 2. It shows that humans are naturally polygynous, but have learned to control the impulse with mixed success. Then why aren't men twice the size of women, like gorillas? Note the assumption shared by both these interpretations, female sexual reticence. In both scenarios, female honor is intact. In the second interpretation, only the male's natural fidelity is in doubt. When the three most closely related apes exhibit the same degree of body size dimorphism, shouldn't we at least consider the possibility that their bodies reflect the same adaptations before we reach for far-fetched, if emotionally reassuring conclusions? It's time to go below the belt.
All's fair in love and sperm war. No case interested and perplexed me so much as the brightly colored hinder ends and adjoining parts of certain monkeys. Charles Darwin.
It seems men weren't fighting much over dates for the past few million years until agriculture, but that doesn't mean Darwin was wrong about male sexual competition being of crucial importance in human evolution. Even among bonobos, who experience little to no overt conflict over sex, Darwinian selection takes place, but on a level Darwin himself probably never considered, or dared discuss publicly anyway. Rather than male bonobos competing to see who gets lucky, they all get lucky and then let their spermatozoa fight it out. Oyvind Vinge, who was working with guppies in the 1930s, coined the term sperm competition. Jeffrey Parker, studying the decidedly unglamorous yellow dung fly, later refined the concept. The idea is simple. If the sperm of more than one male are present in the reproductive tract of an ovulating female, the spermatozoa themselves compete to fertilize the ovum. Females of species that engage in sperm competition typically have various tricks to advertise their fertility, thereby inviting more competitors. Their provocations range from sexy vocalizations or scents to genital swellings that turn every shade of lipstick red, from berry sexy to rouge soleil. The process is something of a lottery, where the male with the most tickets has the best shot at winning, hence the chimp and bonobo's Hume sperm production capabilities. It's also an obstacle course, with the female's body providing various types of hoops to jump through and moats to swim across to reach the egg, thus eliminating unworthy sperm. We'll examine some of these obstacles in following chapters. Some researchers argue that the competition is more like rugby, with various sperm-forming teams with specialized blockers, runners, and so on. Sperm competition takes many forms. Although Darwin might have been perplexed by it, sperm competition preserves the central purpose of male competition in his theory of sexual selection, with the reward to the victor being fertilization of the ovum. But the struggle occurs on the cellular level among the sperm cells, with the female's reproductive tract the field of battle. Male apes living in multi-male social groups, such as chimps, bonobos, and humans, have larger testes housed in an external scrotum, mature later than females, and produce larger volumes of ejaculate containing greater concentrations of sperm cells than primates in which females normally mate with only one male per cycle, such as gorillas, gibbons, and orangutans. And who knows? Perhaps Darwin would have recognized this process if he'd been a bit less indoctrinated by Victorian notions of female sexuality. Sarah Hrdy contends that it was Darwin's presumption that females hold themselves in reserve for the best available male that left him so puzzled by sexual swellings. Hrdy doesn't buy Darwin's coy female shtick for a minute. Although appropriate for many animals, the appellation coy, which was to remain unchallenged dogma for the succeeding 100 years, did not then and does not today apply to the observed behavior of monkey and ape females at mid-cycle. It's possible Darwin was being a bit coy himself in his writings on the sexuality of human females. The poor guy had already insulted God, as most people, including his loving, pious wife, understood the concept. Even if he suspected something like sperm competition had played a role in human evolution, Darwin could hardly be expected to drag the angelic Victorian woman down from her pedestal. Bad enough that Darwinian theory depicts women evolving to prostitute themselves for meat, access to male wealth, and the rest of it. To have argued that ancestral females were shameless trollops motivated by erotic pleasure would have been too much. Still, with characteristic awareness of just how much he didn't and couldn't know, Darwin acknowledged, as these parts are more brightly colored in one sex, female, than in the other, and as they become more brilliant during the season of love, I concluded that the colors had been gained as a sexual attraction. I was well aware that I thus laid myself open to ridicule. Perhaps Darwin did understand that the bright sexual swellings of some female primates serve to stoke male libido, which shouldn't be necessary according to his sexual selection theory. There is even evidence that Darwin may have had reason to ponder sperm competition in humans. In a letter from Bhutan, where he was gathering plants, Darwin's old friend Joseph Hooker discussed the polyandrous humans he was encountering, where a wife may have 10 husbands by law. Moderate body size dimorphism isn't the only anatomical suggestion of promiscuity in our species. The ratio of testicular volume to overall body mass can be used to read the degree of sperm competition in any given species. Jared Diamond considers the theory of testis size to be one of the triumphs of modern physical anthropology. Like most great ideas, the theory of testis size is simple. Species that copulate more often need larger testes, and species in which several males routinely copulate with one ovulating female need even bigger testes. If a species has cojones grandes, you can bet that males have frequent ejaculations with females who sleep around. Where the females save it for Mr. Right, the male have smaller testes relative to their overall body mass. The correlation of slutty females with big bald males appears to apply not only to humans and other primates, but to many mammals, as well as to birds, butterflies, reptiles, and fish. In gorillas' winner-take-all approach to mating, males compete to see who gets all the booty, as it were. So, although an adult silverback gorilla weighs in at around 400 pounds, his penis is just over an inch long at full mast, and his testicles are the size of kidney beans, though you'd have trouble finding them as they're safely tucked up inside his body. A 100-pound bonobo has a penis 3 times as long as the gorilla's and testicles the size of chicken eggs, the extra-large AAA type. In bonobos, since everybody gets some sugar, the competition takes place on the level of the sperm cell, not at the level of the individual male. Still, although almost all bonobos are having sex, given the realities of biological reproduction, each baby bonobo still has only one biological father. So the game's still the same, getting one's genes into the future, but the field of play is different. With harem-based polygynous systems like the gorillas, individual males fight it out before any sex takes place. In sperm competition, the cells fight in there, so males don't have to fight out here. Instead, males can relax around one another, allowing larger group sizes, enhancing cooperation, and avoiding disruption to the social dynamic. This helps explain why no primate living in multi-male social groups is monogamous. It just wouldn't work. As always, natural selection targets the relevant organs and systems for adaptation. Through the generations, male gorillas evolved impressive muscles for their reproductive struggle, while their relatively unimportant genitals dwindled down to the bare minimum needed for uncontested fertilization. Conversely, male chimps, bonobos, and humans had less need for oversized muscles for fighting, but evolved larger, more powerful testicles, and in the case of humans, a much more interesting penis. We can almost hear some of our readers thinking, "But my testicles aren't the size of chicken eggs." No, they're not. But we're guessing they're not tiny kidney beans tucked up inside your abdomen either. Humans fall in the middle ground between gorillas and bonobos on the testicular volume body mass scale. Those who argue that our species has been sexually monogamous for millions of years point out that human testicles are smaller than those of chimps and bonobos. Those who challenge the standard narrative, like us for example, note that human testicular ratios are far beyond those of the polygynous gorilla or the monogamous gibbon. So, is the human scrotum half empty or half full? Chapter 16. The Truest Measure of a Man.
Small. Both chimps and bonobos are far more promiscuous than we are. Our testicles reflect this. They are mere peanuts compared to our ape relatives, coconuts.